Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 108 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. And we got a bit of a special one for you today. There has been a full-blown attack from the Proof of Weapons network on peaceful proof of work. And we're going to unmask all the evil players, all the people that may not be what they seem to be, so that you can understand how to analyze this. Now, this isn't about character assassinations. This isn't about anything else other than understanding the systemic nature of how the Proof of Weapons network uses their weapons. They weaponize technology. They weaponize media. They primarily weaponize financial weapons of mass destruction. And they also weaponize military. And we're going to be going through all the tools today to understand the different operations. But the overarching theme of what we're going to be covering today is we are going to be unmasking the Epstein Bitcoin theory. So there was an attack to try and associate Bitcoin with Jeffrey Epstein. And as with all things, we take a nuanced approach. We're not here to do propaganda. We're here to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth as I see it. And we're going to be going through, and I'm going to be sharing stories from the early days of Bitcoin and the early characters of Bitcoin that in fact did have a connection with Jeffrey Epstein. And we need to be honest about this, because in order to combat what they are throwing, the reality of the way they do this is there is 95% truth, and then they forget the 5% in there that completely changes the reality of it. So we're going to be covering all of that. And I'm going to be sharing stories today that I've never shared from the early days of Bitcoin. And in unmasking the Bitcoin theory, of course, we're going to turn this into the Jeffrey Epstein Bitcoin theory. We're going to turn this into an educational experience. So we're also going to be going through the JP Morgan links. If you're a long-term listener of Bitcoin Hard Talk, no surprise there. We have unearthed many of those. And also, of course, the Trump leverage game that's happening right now, so that you can stop subscribing to these stupid narratives of Democrats versus Republicans and fully understand what's happening at the level that they don't want you to see. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the first section. I'll cover all three that we're going to be doing. We're covering This Week in Bitcoin, which is answering the question, did Jeffrey Epstein fund Bitcoin, and were there attack vectors that we should be aware of with the Bitcoin core developers? We're going to be answering that question. In part two, we're going to be covering This Week in Macro. And what I want you to understand is the framework by which the Proof of Weapons network weaponizes these blackmail operations and criminal networks like Jeffrey Epstein in order to influence the macro market and create manipulation and vassalization of public companies using both the equity and debt capital markets, with some live case studies in what happened this week that I covered last week, but the updates since in terms of strategy, JP Morgan, and the other financial weapons of mass destruction that are under current operations to vassalize those companies in order to fear you into selling your Bitcoin. In part three, we're going to be doing This Week in Geopolitics. And this way, I'm going to be going through everything that has happened with the email leaks, the previous operations. We're going to go through Trump's history, his connections to the network, so that we can understand what it actually means and the geopolitical implications that I've been covering a lot. So without further ado, let's jump straight into This Week in Bitcoin. Did Jeffrey Epstein fund Bitcoin? Now, what I want to do is do a little bit of a recap. So remember, we went through in previous episodes all these different attack vectors. So Bitcoin is always under a state of attack. And we saw three of the operations that we have been covering in previous episodes, but we got to see them live this week. So the first attack was the big reveal. There was media that was weaponized in order to demonstrate some connections between some of the core developers in Bitcoin Core, while simultaneously weaponizing other nodes in the Proof of Weapons network that are wolf in sheep's clothing, like Barry Silbert, in order to do a PR campaign for Zcash simultaneously. We'll go through that and the stories that nobody knows. There was also a second attack this week, And that was a full-blown vassalization strategy on strategy. MicroStrategy, MSTR, and the financial weapons of mass destruction that have been constructed around it in order to push Saylor into full submission, while it looks like he's taking on the establishment JP Morgan. And there was a massive PR campaign with some of the other nodes that may not know whose agenda they're serving. We're going to go through that, everything that happened since last week. Attack Vector 3 was a further vassalization of Tether. Now, that doesn't require much vassalization because obviously it is connected deeply to the fiat currency proof of weapons network and providing much of the financial weapons of mass destruction, backing it in order to roll over the debt cycle in the US through fiscal dominance. But we're going to be going through all of those and highlighting them so that you can see through all the narrative, all the shit that's being put out there, and just have the understanding of what's really happening. So as a reminder, Bitcoin is always under a constant state of attack. What is Bitcoin? You got to understand it in order to not see through the, see through the noise and the narrative. So what is Bitcoin? Firstly, it is open source code. That means anybody that wants to look at the code can look at the code, and everybody does look at the code. And if you want to improve the code, you put forward Bitcoin improvement proposals. And there is a network of developers as well as competing developers as we go into this chaotic open source boardroom where we debate the future of Bitcoin. Now, just because developers want to change something, you still got to get buy-in from the miners. Now, the miners are the ones that are adding blocks to the blockchain. We package up all the transactions every 10 minutes. And because we don't want any central bank or any bank in the middle, the miners agree and reach consensus, and they solve these mass problems. One that solves the problem fastest gets a block reward plus a bunch of transaction fees that subsidize the network. And that network is now the largest distributed supercomputer in the world. Now, they can signal whether they agree with changes in the code. And when they do a signal out there, it has to reach a certain activation point. Once it hits a certain activation point, they then have to actually run the code. But then at the same time, they're just simply adding blocks to the blockchain. Now, if you run your own self-custody Bitcoin, you can also run a node, and miners also run nodes, but anybody can run a node. The last time we were in a major Bitcoin war was the block war debate. In the block war debate, it was determined that if you make the blocks too large in order to reduce the transaction fees, then you might end up with only rich people being able to run those nodes. On the flip side, if you have higher fees with smaller blocks, then you can have more people running those nodes. Now, there are things like SPV software, various other things. I don't want to get geeky because I want you to understand the high-level game theory. But those nodes, the more nodes we have, the more of a resistance we have against the miners. The miners are investing significant capital. So the miners are always subjected to receiving capital. And when they receive capital, that subjects them to the whims of their shareholders in those companies. There are private companies, large ones like Tether, and there are public companies, a lot of those in Texas that are public on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. And then there are state sovereigns that are also mining. And all of these different actors make up the total hash power. The hash power is what secures the network, that makes it impossible for any central bank, sovereign state, bank, or any actor to take down the network, because these miners are distributed all around the world. You know, we used to have about 60% of the hash power in China. About 40% of that moved over to America through these public companies. 20% remains there. We have about 11% in Russia, 2 to 6% in Iran and various other countries. You have a lot across Europe, across the global south, across Africa, across Central and South America. And it is distributed across Asia as well in order to ensure that no one country centralizes too much of that Bitcoin. Now, the largest player used to be China. Now it's America. And we need to keep an eye of that, because the proof of weapons network is hosted. The host country is the United States of America via the US stock market, and BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and the asset managers that pull together all of the American pension money, endowment funds, and various other funds. So what is the nodes? Well, they can essentially process transactions. And if they don't want to process transactions because they believe, for example, a bunch of companies are getting together and colluding to work with the developers and the miners, then we have something called a user-activated soft fork. And this was the resistance that was used against the miners during the block war debate, because the developers couldn't agree with the miners. And so a lot of venture capitalists were colluding via Barry Silbert and other people that were investing in all the Bitcoin mining companies and trying to enforce changes across it. So that is what Bitcoin is. With that in mind, you know that there are no back doors, but there are choke points. And we need to understand those choke points, because those choke points are always under attack. But it is the largest and most distributed supercomputer and the most distributed supercomputer that we have in the world. And it's the best that we have. Nothing else in the crypto market competes with it. It's all an iteration of a pre-mined shitcoin connected with somebody else with Silicon Valley funding and various other 51% attack vectors, because it doesn't have enough hash power, or it's got proof of stake, which means that whoever accumulates the most coins can govern the network, or it's a fork of Bitcoin where a few players funded the mining operation and they're centralized in some deep state dark actors. And I'm going to be going through some of the history of that so that you can understand it. Now, what I want to do very quickly is a quick reminder. This is best understood if you have already watched my big 3-hour marathon that I did on whether the CIA created Bitcoin. Now, just to bring you up to speed, I created a 5-minute whiteboard AI summary of that 3-hour marathon. And I'm going to play that for you right now, just in case you don't have time to go back and watch it. I would love for you to go back and watch it. You can go to simondixon.com, or you can go to BitcoinHardTalk on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can go to YouTube, type in Simon Dixon, CIA, and you'll find that video over there. But what I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to share my screen and make sure we are all on the same page, because we're going to build upon that understanding, our understanding of what Bitcoin is and how it's constantly under attack, so that you can make better decisions. And then I'm going to go through some stories of the Jeffrey Epstein side, where it was funded, what it is funded, what the attack vectors are, and some stories that you may never have heard from my early days of investing in many of the companies in this sector. So let's jump right in with the first video. And this is going to be about 5 minutes, whiteboard summary of the CIA video. Let me make sure the sound is on. Yep, you got the sound. You should be able to see the screen now. I'm going to go full screen, and we're going to play for you now.
All right, so today we're diving into a theory that's been absolutely blowing up the crypto space. It comes from a nearly 3-hour-long podcast episode hosted by the one and only Simon Dixon, a true Bitcoin OG, on his show BitcoinHardTalk. Yeah, so just a little while ago, on October 24th, 2025, this massive episode dropped, and it went viral almost immediately. And it was all about trying to answer a question that just keeps coming up. Specifically, this one wild theory about who really created Bitcoin. And when I say wild, I mean, we're talking about a story that pulls in international spies, the mob. I mean, it's a real rabbit hole. And the original episode, it clocked in at just under 3 hours. 2 hours and 54 minutes, to be exact. I mean, who has that kind of time? Well, that's where we come in. We watch the whole thing, so you don't have to. We're going to break down that entire sprawling theory for you in just 5 minutes. So, you ready? Here's the TLDR. Let's get into it. So, the whole reason this became a huge deal is because of comments just like this one. You hear people, even pretty big names, saying things like, "I won't buy Bitcoin because I believe it was created by the CIA." And look, when you hear that, it kind of makes you nervous, right? So Simon Dixon's podcast really set out to investigate, is there any fire behind all this smoke? Okay, let's get into the first clue. And believe it or not, the theory starts with the name itself. So the podcast brings up this idea from a guy named Richard Warner. He points out that in Japanese, you say the family name first, so it would be Nakamoto Satoshi. And if you break that down, Nakamoto can translate to center origin, and Satoshi, that can mean intelligence. So you put them together, and what do you get? Central intelligence. Kind of spooky, right? So the question is, was this some kind of clever wink and a nod from an intelligence agency? A clue left behind, just hiding in plain sight for anyone who bothered to look. Okay, but that leads to the next big question, the motive. I mean, why on earth would a government agency create a decentralized currency? It seems totally counterintuitive. Well, the podcast dives into two pretty compelling and honestly kind of chilling potential reasons. First, there's the gateway drug theory. The idea is that Bitcoin was just a trial balloon, a way to get us all comfortable with the idea of digital money before they roll out their own stuff, central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, which they would totally control. The second theory is, well, it's a lot darker. It's the honeypot theory. That Bitcoin was designed to get everyone to pour their money into it, only for the creators to flip a switch on a secret back door and seize it all. But here's where the story gets really, really weird. Just when you think it's all about spies and government agencies, the podcast takes a massive left turn. It suggests a deeper, darker origin story that doesn't start with the CIA, it starts with the mob. Yeah, you heard that right. The theory centers on this one guy, Meyer Lansky. If you don't know the name, he was basically the financial genius for the criminal underworld, an absolute savant when it came to moving money and building systems. And the secret history they lay out is just incredible. The theory goes that by the 1960s, Lansky's network had pretty much compromised the entire Federal Reserve. The famous Nixon shock in '71, when the US went off the gold standard, the podcast alleges that was a direct response, a desperate move to wrestle back control. And in retaliation, Lansky's network supposedly funded the very first private digital currency, something called DigiCash. So, okay, let's pause there. If that was the original plan, a private, centralized digital currency controlled by this shadow network, then how in the world did we end up with the public, decentralized Bitcoin that we all know today? What happened? Well, this is the crucial plot twist. The theory is that the project's code went open source. The moment that happened, the original creators completely lost control. And a whole new generation of cryptographers and privacy advocates, the cypherpunks, they jumped on it and took over. And this crazy chain of events, from mob money to these cypherpunk idealists, is what leads the podcast to its final suspect for who Satoshi really was. A man named Len Sassaman. He was a brilliant cryptographer, a key figure in that early cypherpunk movement, and a passionate advocate for internet privacy. And when you look at the tale of the tape, it's pretty compelling. Satoshi's very academic writing style, it lines up perfectly with Sassaman, who was a PhD student. Satoshi posting at weird hours for the US, but normal for Europe, and using British spellings. Well, Sassaman was an American living in Belgium. But here's the kicker, the potential smoking gun. His PhD supervisor was David Sham, the guy who founded DigiCash. I mean, it's a pretty compelling case, right? But this is where the podcast wraps up by asking what might be the most important question of all. Even if any of this is true, does it actually matter? Because here's the thing, the crucial point is that whatever the original plan might have been, a centralized closed source system with a secret backdoor, that's not what Bitcoin became. The moment it went open source, it morphed into the complete opposite of that. Decentralized, open source, no backdoor possible, controlled by no one. And this quote from Mark Yusko, who was on the podcast, really hits the nail on the head. He says, "The beauty of the system is that it is anonymous. One guy can't show up and change that." Basically, the way Bitcoin is designed makes the creator's identity and whatever their original plan was almost completely irrelevant. And that's really Bitcoin's core defense, right? The code is open source. You, me, anyone can go look at it right now. The network is spread out all over the world on thousands of computers. There's no single point of failure. You can't just shut down a headquarters or lean on a CEO. To change anything major, you need to get the majority of users to agree. Good luck with that. Which brings us to the final question, the one to really chew on. This whole origin story is a fascinating rabbit hole for sure. Spies, mobsters, brilliant cryptographers. But at the end of the day, in a system that's built on transparent, open code that's controlled by no one, does the ghost in the machine really change anything at all?
And of course, the answer is no. It looks like my camera's not sharing. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Okay, awesome. All right. So that was from what I did in that podcast is I went through a bunch of different videos and theories. And that was with Uncle Jack. Many people asked if we could do a podcast together. I think it would be worth doing that at some point. Let me know in the comments section whether you'd like to actually see that as well. But I wanted to just lay that foundation to make sure that this is not manipulated, because many people just don't understand how Bitcoin works and think that there's some kind of backdoor or something like that. Because now we're going to go through many of the attacks that we saw this week. And my overarching theory is, and by the way, when we talk about Len, I think other people were involved as well. So you might want to watch the whole episode to get my full thoughts on that as well. But I want you to make sure that my overarching theory here is that it is the gateway drug theory rather than the honeypot. And the gateway drug theory means that this was a mechanism and there was a resistance to open source it in order to get people used to transacting online and then transition to the stablecoin central bank digital currency standard that we're on, which is why I preach and try and help people understand who's part of the network, whose agenda are different players on. Because when you're listening to people, you may not know, and they may not know who they're actually working for, because these are all covert operations as well. So let's have a look at some of the attacks and how I interpret them from a proof of weapons network and from my belief that they are trying to get you into the gateway drug of stablecoins and central bank digital currencies and centralizing Bitcoin into Wall Street and financial industrial complex wrappers. So attack vector 1. It was posted that Jeffrey Epstein was funding Bitcoin core developers. And so I want to go through the history that many people may not know of how Bitcoin developers were funded. So obviously you had the very, very beginning, and you had the group that were involved with Satoshi Nakamoto. We gave some theories of who they are, many of whom are no longer with us today, whether it be the Hal Finneys and the others that we covered as well. You can go back to that video. But anyway, they bootstrapped the network, they open sourced the network, and they were the first to mine it. What that means is that they fare with anyone else. They were the first to know. They launched it on the Cypherpunk mailing list and said anyone can mine it once it was built in January 2009. The white paper was released in 2008. Then there was, the network was there. People could fire up their laptop and they could mine some Bitcoin. People used to receive for very little electricity, and just by having a laptop with CPU power, 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes in order to bootstrap the network. And then more and more people would start mining. And the more and more people that were mining, then you ended up where it's more difficult to mine. And so therefore, the early Bitcoins were mined by the first miners on the network or from their laptop. And then eventually it went to graphics cards and GPUs. And then eventually China and various other companies across Europe and China created the first ASICs, which are specialist mining equipment that could mine faster than any other CPU or GPU. But one of the, where were the developers actually funded? Well, originally it was just a bunch of people that would pull their money together. They would have a Bitcoin wallet address and people could contribute Bitcoin. And some of the early developers would just be funded through donations and contributions. Now, when I joined round about 2011, after writing the first published book in 2010 that was launched later, I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference, and Max Kaiser, a journalist on RT, and myself invested in a company called BitPay. And now BitPay started to use some of its funding because it was trying to create like a PayPal or Bitcoin where you could accept Bitcoin, then you would receive fiat currency to make it easy for merchants. It started allocating some of its revenue to some of the early developers. And so this became corporate interest. Now, why would somebody do that? Why would a company do that? Well, they obviously have an agenda, because as you take on investors, you work for your shareholders. And as you become a more professional company, you have a board of executives rather than just one entrepreneur. And then you have a board that's normally from your shareholders. And that gives oversight to the executives, and the board works and represents the shareholders. And so the shareholders then could manipulate or influence where they wanted Bitcoin development to go, because the money was coming from essentially the shareholders' value. And so that's a problem. And so the next idea was that there would be a foundation, and a foundation was set up called the Bitcoin Foundation. And this was basically funded. And one of their first missions was to work with kind of PR issues, but also to fund developers. Now, this was more of a decentralized group of interested companies. And so you had early companies that would be interested in supporting Bitcoin. And so rather than just one company like BitPay, you would have multiple companies that would all contribute to a foundation. And then the foundation would have a governance document and a mission statement. But the Bitcoiners really started to go and unearth many of the members that were part of the Bitcoin Foundation. So it then became more decentralized. So originally it was the creators, then it was corporations, now it was a foundation. And who was a member of some of those foundations? Well, one of them, in order to follow the money and understand that Bitcoin has always been under attack, you can start to look at what happened to some of those early members. One of them, and again, I'll just share you stories from my perspective of being around many of these characters in the early days and investing in many of the companies to try and support the industry. As the value of Bitcoin grew, I would share it out around the ecosystem to fund developers, fund companies, and try and turn this into something. One of them was a guy called Charlie Shrem. Now, Charlie Shrem was later arrested after joining the Bitcoin Foundation. He created a company called BitInstant. If you type in my name, Charlie Shrem, you'll see me on some of his podcasts from back in the day. But he was arrested on his way to Bitcoin Miami conference, because through his company that was connected to an exchange called Mt. Gox, you were able to take some of those funds and use them in some of the dark web marketplaces that people were using them. The most famous at the time was called Silk Road. And so when you are a centralized company, you have to comply with anti-money laundering regulations, KYC regulations, Bank Secrecy Act, and all sorts of stuff. You can no longer be a missionary player. You have to submit to what you have to do as a fiduciary duty to your shareholders. Now, Bitcoin regulations, was it money? Wasn't it money? One of the early court cases was a guy called Trendon Shavers who created a Ponzi scheme, and it was determined through his lawyer. I think he was represented by a guy called Jason Seibert, if I remember correctly, and he got it where it was determined in court that Bitcoin is money. So now we knew that Bitcoin was money as classified in court via a Ponzi scheme, and it had nothing to do with Bitcoin. It was a Ponzi scheme of somebody that used Bitcoin in order to try and draw in investors, started paying those investors from future returns, and therefore we had the classic definition. Now, he went to prison. Charlie Shrem got determined that you have to actually have a money transmitter license. So now these companies have to bow down to the agenda. But Bitcoin still remains Bitcoin because there's no door to knock on. There's no executive to arrest. There's nobody to blackmail. There's no one to engage in this. So you start looking at the attack vectors. Now, Charlie Shrem was put down in prison for engaging in what he pleaded guilty to money laundering because people used his platform in order to purchase, purchase drugs on a dark website via an exchange called Mt. Gox. Now, Mt. Gox had a member on the Bitcoin Foundation that was a French guy that lived in Japan called Mark Capellis. Now, Mark Capellis, he bought Mt. Gox. He didn't create Mt. Gox. And he bought it, and it was missing when he purchased it 80,000 Bitcoin. Now, he didn't know when he purchased the exchange that it was missing 80,000 Bitcoin. And so he later went back to the person that he purchased it from and said, where is the 80,000 Bitcoin that we owe to our customers? Because what happens when you create an exchange? You create fractional reserve Bitcoin. You create paper representatives. People that thought they had Bitcoin on Mt. Gox, in fact, had an IOU, which is a centralized database. Now, the underlying Bitcoin, you cannot fractionally reserve. But once you put it in an exchange, you create paper Bitcoin. So who did Mark Capellis buy this exchange from? Well, he bought it from a guy called Jeb McCaleb. Who's Jeb McCaleb? He was the creator of a token called XRP, who essentially took that token and sold it to a bunch of companies or a company that was part of the banking network. And so the bank started creating competition to Swift and ended up with approximately 60% of this XRP token in a company called Ripple Labs. Full disclosure, I was investing in fintech at the time, and Ripple Labs was one of the companies I later invested in. Over time, I didn't want to support the banking system. And so whenever I can exit those shares, I exit those shares. I've been cleansing myself of these shares because I want to remain independent. I don't want to have to bow down to a shareholder's agenda. But obviously, the shareholders can influence the companies when you understand corporate governance. Who else was involved in that network? A guy called John Matonis. So look at this right now. You had an attack vector on money laundering regulations. You had an attack vector on also via John Matonis. Now, John Matonis, what did he do later? Well, later, although he was part of the Bitcoin Foundation and the chairman of the foundation, he brought somebody into our community. And whether he brought him in or whether he was fooled or whether he was blackmailed or whatever, I don't know. All I know is I'm following the incentives, where he later brought somebody to the community that claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto. His name was Dr. Craig Wright. And so what did they end up creating shortly after? A hard fork and a different version of Bitcoin. So this led us to the block war debates, because essentially, Craig Wright was a psyop that was injected into the ecosystem in order to create alternative versions. Now, he created a hard fork in partnership with some of the miners in China called Bitcoin Cash. And so by partnering with these Chinese miners who had created the ASICs, and they were using their ASIC machines in order to mine Bitcoin faster than the GPUs and CPUs, you ended up with an attack vector where people and some of the early developers, a guy like Mike Hearn, had a hissy fit saying Bitcoin is too centralized in China. He sold all of his Bitcoin, I think at about $100 or so, saying that the project has failed because of this. And so then the miners colluded, and they started to say, well, we don't want what the developers are doing. The developers, we want them to increase the block size. We want to work with various companies, and you had this decentralized boardroom debate. I remember when I was at Hong Kong, when the Hong Kong agreement was signed between the miners and the developers, and the roadmap was set. But just because it was signed in a shadowy boardroom, it became out in public. It went onto the forums and everyone started to debate it. And people started to say, we don't want the future of Bitcoin to be determined between the miners and the core developers and a bunch of influential venture capitalists. And so they didn't get their way. But there was an attack vector sent in called Dr. Craig Wright, who pretended he was Bitcoin creator. He pretended he was Satoshi Nakamoto, and he got one of the core developers that had previously met with the CIA but when Satoshi Nakamoto left the project, in order to endorse him and say, I saw that he controlled the Satoshi wallet keys. Turned out that he didn't control the Satoshi wallet keys. In fact, Gavin Andresen, one of the developers that ended up joining with Bitcoin Cash, with the Chinese miners as well, ended up leaving development. And there was a whole story around control of the GitHub repo, which is the open source developer community where all the code is hosted. Now, one of the early investors, when I was investing in many of the companies, blockchain.com, later Coinbase, Shapeshift, various others with early Bitcoiners as well, Circle, which later launched USDC, all of these companies started as Bitcoin companies, but because they were under a corporate wrapper, they needed to maximize shareholder value and receive VC funding. So the VCs in Silicon Valley were able to influence. When I was investing, it was just us Bitcoiners that were on a mission to take on the banks and make sure that it remained decentralized. So now, via these companies, what happens? All of these companies maximizing shareholder returns would launch shitcoins, get into stable coins, go into all sorts of other stuff in order to maximize the revenue for those corporate entities. Now, it supports the growth of Bitcoin, but people need to be aware of the attack vectors. Now, one of the influential investors at the time was a guy called Roger Ver. He was at the time the biggest investor. Myself and Bank to the Future were investing in many of the different companies. But he was, again, an early supporter of Bitcoin Cash. Now, what I am saying here is that many times you don't know what a corporate agenda is doing, and you don't know what these people are connected and affiliated with. And half the time, they don't know who they're working for. Now, what happened with Roger Ver recently? He was arrested in Spain for what was called tax evasion. And that tax evasion from the early days of Bitcoin was because he put some Bitcoin in a corporate wrapper. And maybe that was held over Roger Ver. I don't know. I'm not making any accusations. I'm just saying that there is constant attacks under this network, which is why we created the mantra in Bitcoin, don't trust, verify. Because we don't want any central point of failure like all the other crypto projects that can be hijacked, can be taken over, and all these different things. So what happened to Gavin Andresen? Well, he went and met with the CIA. The CIA had wanted a meeting in terms of what is Bitcoin. He was handed the project by Satoshi Nakamoto. And as soon as he found out that Gavin Andresen went to the CIA, Satoshi Nakamoto left the project. And at the same time, it was utilized on WikiLeaks by Julian Assange because WikiLeaks was being attacked and taken down by the banking system, Visa, MasterCard, Bank of America. What is the financial choke points that happen here? That's what they're doing right now. They're taking people that had that are involved in the community and saying, we'll take out your bank account. What happens next? They're partnering with other players that are compromised into the proof of weapons network. All of these attack vectors constantly happen. And so it was Gavin Andresen and Craig Wright with Roger Ver that supported Bitcoin Cash, which was the next attack and a hard fork. Now, later they attacked Bitcoin Cash and went into Bitcoin SV. And then we had, different other players like Calvin Ayre, who has a very bad background, but was also investing in a ginormous mining farm and became probably the only miner for Bitcoin SV. And they both went through 51% attacks because nothing had the hash power like Bitcoin did as well. Now, another controversial character that was part of the Bitcoin Foundation. So you had all these people was Brock Pierce. Now, Brock Pierce, he basically, I remember I was at a conference Where was it? I can't even remember. I think it was Mexico, or maybe it was one of Bruce Fenton's early conference, Satoshi Roundtable. And I remember he was zonked out telling me for hours and hours and hours why he knew that Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto, and tried to persuade me and bring me onto that. Now, he was investing in a lot of the companies. At this point, I was I was deciding that the more and more investments you make, the more and more people try and compromise you into these attack vectors. Now, I'm not saying anything about, Brock Pierce. This is all public information. But if you look up on the internet, Brock Pierce, you'll notice that there were allegations and settlements around sexual crimes. He was somebody that was involved in Silicon Valley. He created a video streaming site. He was a child actor involved in the Hollywood industry. And later it turned out that he actually, on the public record, met with Jeffrey Epstein. And this is what was revealed in some of these allegations as well. So you know how these things work. They want, and I'm going to cover this in the macro and geopolitical section, the idea of these sexual blackmail networks is to compromise everybody that they can try and influence. And so whether it happened, whether it's not, that's not my thing to judge here. My judge here is that you can see the attack vectors around everybody that was involved, because there was a very deliberate strategy to try and attack some of these people and get them in the network. Now, what did Brock Pierce do? Well, he was investing in the industry. He created a venture capital fund with partners called Blockchain Capital that was trying to acquire all the different companies in the industry. He also invested in a project that later turned into Tether. And he sold that project to Bitfinex. And Bitfinex was one of the exchanges that came from one of the big hacked exchanges. God, I forget the name of the exchanges now. I've forgotten the name of it now. It will come back to me later. Well, anyway, they bought the code, and later they launched the project Tether. Now, Tether was called something else when it was originally purchased. If I remember correctly, True USD or something like that. But it was a way of getting money between all these different exchanges so you could arbitrage. Now, what have we got here? Brock Pierce created what later became Tether. Tether was sold to Bitfinex. Stablecoins were invented as a mechanism. Remember what I said, the original theory, gateway drug theory. And what is stablecoins now? It's the precursor and the privatized version of a central bank digital currency. Again, I'm not saying that all these people were coordinated. I am saying that there are operations to compromise different parts of the ecosystem. Now, what happened with Bitfinex? It was weaponized by the CFTC. A bunch of money was seized in the banking sector, which removed those reserves. They ended up having to, and there was an attack on the exchange. 17,000 Bitcoins were hacked from that exchange via these covert operations. Now, I was one of the people that had became a shareholder in Bitfinex because we put together a recovery plan that meant that Bitfinex didn't need to go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And so we pulled together all the people that were going to lose all their money, and the lawyers would have stolen all their money like they did for Celsius, BlockFi, FTX, all the others. And instead, we gave them a Bitcoin token that represented the claim that made them a shareholder in Bitfinex. I became one of those shareholders. We ended up owning 40% of the company, and it recovered, and it didn't need to go into Chapter 11. But the goal of that hack was to send Bitfinex into Chapter 11 at the same time as having these other things that happened. So you had the weaponization of regulators, the weaponization of banks and financial censorship, and you had covert hacking operations. I don't want to go too deep into that. But after all of these controversies around the members of Bitcoin Foundation, you had arrests, you had all these people that were compromised, you had Brock Pierce, all these other things. the Bitcoin Foundation was completely demoralized, distinguished, it completely, the community had enough of it. And so it stopped funding the Bitcoin core developers. What did they do? They wanted to exert a handover of how to fund these different developers, as the project now was about 2015, and we were turning into a multi-billion-dollar project at this time. So in 2015, MIT, the college, basically funded some of the Bitcoin developers via a subset called Digital Currency Institute or something, I think it was called. And they launched a side project. So MIT had an innovation lab, as it were, with these NGOs and different networks. And then they funded a project called DCI, Digital Currency, I think it was, initiative. Maybe people in the comments can say whether I got this right. It's been a while. This was 10 years ago. And so the Bitcoin developers had MIT funding that went into DCI, and DCI took a subset of their funding and started supporting some of the Bitcoin core developers. Now, you see why it's very important for us to have this open source code with a network of developers with competing implementations. I'm going into the basics. There were more stories with competing implementations as well. But what is it that it was released recently? It was released old news. What was that old news? That MIT had some funding from Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein started commenting around 2017 on crypto and started speaking with various other influential people in the Trump administration around, supporting crypto and tax legislation. So MIT launched DCI. DCI funded some of the Bitcoin core developers, and then we had the next phase of funding these developers. Others would raise finance, put up a Bitcoin QR code, and people could contribute to the developers where they wanted some of the Bitcoin improvement proposals to go through. Now, what happened after that? Well, a company that was founded by Adam Back, who was mentioned in the white paper and was a part of the cypherpunk movement, he then raised a bunch of money and created a corporate wrapper. And that corporate wrapper was a company called Blockstream. And that company called Blockstream brought with it a bunch of the developers. And they used the Bitcoin treasury strategy, the same one we were using at Bank to the Future, because we didn't get any Silicon Valley money because we held Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And we didn't go public or do any of the things that the other companies did because we held Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And we didn't do what Saylor's doing, where you raise money from corporate debt investors and institutional investors so that they can then determine the future of the strategy of the company. And so Blockstream basically funded a bunch of Bitcoin developers, but it raised finance from a bunch of other types of investors. Who were some of their investors? One of them was Blockchain Capital. Blockchain Capital was part of Brock Pierce's network to invest. One of the others was Bitfinex. Another one was a company called AXA Ventures. And then people start to look at, well, who are AXA Ventures? So you can start looking through the history and you'll realize that one of the CEOs of AXA was Hen de Castres, who's basically a member of a Bilderberg group, and many others that would meet. And so you had a company that was in the midst of the block war debate, and we had people try to take it over, determine the influence of the code, but the decentralized nature of the network meant that even when the users didn't like it, the node operators were able to run a threat of a user-activated soft fork. I remember the day it actually got activated, which was a different, an upgrade in the code to increase the block size without needing a hard fork. I don't want to get geeky into it. It was called segregated witness. And Barry Silbert, who was from Digital Currency Group, the one that went into, basically created Grayscale and all the other things that created the recent crash in 2021. I don't want to go too deep into that. Barry Silbert at Digital Currency Group tried to consolidate all the companies in order to get a block size increase plus the addition to the code. And that was the big block war. So you can look through that. Then many people were saying, we don't want Blockstream to be funding core developers. So some of those developers went away from Blockstream. You had Luke Dash Jr., various others, and they started to invest and build their own initiatives. So what we're saying here is that this is always under attack. And the point of Bitcoin is we have this open source boardroom where we expose all these things. Now, what was the next attack vector? Well, Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald, created by Howard Lutnick, as deep state as it gets. And what would he do? He would go along. He's now in the Trump administration as the Commerce Secretary. And he would solve Tether's issue. He would start to back it by treasuries, become influential into the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and allow Tether to custody its backing of its stablecoin, which is US treasuries, and now become the 17th largest lender to the US government. So now it's strategically important as we are in this fiscal dominance stage and the debt is being rolled over. Now, what else did Cantor Fitzgerald do? Well, they started going out to as many influential people in Bitcoin and say, hey, why don't we create a Bitcoin treasury company? Why don't we also allow for Bitcoin-backed loans? Why don't we mine some fiat currency because they're connected into the Federal Reserve primary dealer network, and they buy these bonds and they're a buyer of last resort while influencing policy to push rates down at the moment in the Trump administration. But anyway, prior to that, he would go around and try and take as many companies public, create all these different Bitcoin treasury companies, and he'd go to Adam Back and say, right, you're now vassalized into the Blockstream network. Why don't you start promoting stable coins? Or why don't you start creating Bitcoin treasury companies? And so Adam Back, originally a cypherpunk, is now promoting shares in a company with questionable shareholders, launching or promoting the stable coins, and also launching Bitcoin treasury companies. And so this is the process of vassalization that I always talk about. The financial industrial complex uses their financial weapons of mass destruction in order to bring people into that governance structure where you are no longer sovereign, which is what Bitcoin was here to create. It was here to create the ability for you to own your own money, spend your own money, and have a network that can't be printed. No derivatives printing, no stock printing, no crypto printing, no stablecoin printing, no bond printing, no dollar printing, no fiat printing. But everyone gets vassalized through this financial industrial complex. So Adam Back created a Bitcoin treasury company. Luke Dash Jr. created recently a competing implementation of software that can be run on nodes called Bitcoin Knots, and it creates a resistance. And so we have those open source boardroom debates as well. And we have constant attack, just like this. And I'm only entering into a small part of the history of what got us here to the point where we are this $2.3 trillion network backed by the most amount of hash power, the largest distributed supercomputer with attack after attack after attack. And so what is Bitcoin? I remind you, open source code on a distributed supercomputer where transactions are processed on anybody that wants to run a node. And users can resist through user-activated soft forks. And one of those resistance, as I said, came when we needed to resist against Barry Silbert that tried to create Segwit 2x. And what did he do? He invested in a company called Zcash. And Zcash, which was using zero-knowledge proof technology that was mainly innovated at Tel Aviv University, that relied upon 6 developers, one of them a Bitcoin developer, called Peter Todd that recently was accused of being Satoshi in a documentary, another attack vector. Now, that Peter Todd, we had to rely upon him destroying his key in Zcash. And there was a centralized company that was launched alongside Zcash that charged a tax on all the different Zcash that were mined into a centralized company. That centralized company now needs to deal with regulators. And it relied upon code. It may have changed later. I didn't continue to follow the project, but you had to rely upon a promise from Peter Todd and other people that you need the keys, the original keys were destroyed in a network where there is zero knowledge transactions, but you can't even check them on the blockchain. So what happened recently? We had an attack. The attack was, let's push Zcash. Barry Silbert goes on TV. The network of ETFs that wrap around Zcash were launched. You had that centralized company that has to go through the compliance, and everyone goes on TV and says Zcash is the future, at the same time as connecting Bitcoin to Jeffrey Epstein, giving half-truths so that people would sell their Bitcoin while simultaneously launching a second attack at the same time by the financial industrial complex through their new tool, which is called Strategy, MSTR, that everybody says is the one that's bringing all this new adoption into Bitcoin, is creating a Wall Street wrapper that centralizes as much Bitcoin as possible. And because he is very, very good at pitching what Bitcoin is and saying how fiat currency is going to zero and that Bitcoin goes up, and therefore, what should you do? Borrow fiat currency to buy Bitcoin. And once you have that Bitcoin, use it as collateral and borrow against it again. And if you don't have access to that credit, I'll create a company that gets as much Bitcoin as possible, issues debt, and therefore I can just do it for you and you can buy my shares. And through this mechanism, the more that I borrow, the more shares I sell, the more subservient it becomes to the financial industrial complex. And so through this mechanism, there is approximately 650,000 Bitcoins, which is about 3% of the supply in a public company. That public company has shareholders. And so you have a vehicle that looks like a resistance, but is actually giving more and more power to the proof of weapons network and the financial industrial complex. So how are we doing at Strategy? Well, it owns 650,000 Bitcoin. It has $54 million of cash, and it has committed to $700 million of annual obligations, which means that it doesn't have enough cash to pay its obligations on the products that it recently launched. And it has promises to corporate debt investors, to hedge fund operators like Jane Street, to its shareholders like Vanguard and the longer term investors, the equity investors, as well as the debt investors. And so all of these different financial weapons of mass destruction are used in order to make Michael Saylor, via its corporate entity Strategy, submit to its shareholders and its debt holders. That is how these things work. And so you cannot pay those liabilities now that these additional debt instruments and preference shares and dividend paying instruments have created. And so how do you pay that? Well, one way of paying it is raising additional debt or equity through the debt capital markets or the equity capital markets. What does that mean? Now, when Michael Saylor or Strategy announces that they've done a fundraise, it sells out very quickly. Do you think that's because they're reaching out to all these retail investors and these retail investors are gobbling up this project? No, it is purchased by the financial industrial complex, and now it has full capture of this tool. Why would they want that tool to go bust? Because they have created the perfect tool for manipulating the short-term price of Bitcoin in its financial industrial complex alongside other tools. And if you can get it to have not enough cash to pay its debt liabilities, that is exactly what the IMF was created for. That's exactly what it was created for. So what's the second way that they could pay that additional liability? Well, they could increase revenue. So what did strategy do? It leaked out that it's going to start paying yield, and it would create a Bitcoin bank. And so what is a Bitcoin bank? Well, under the Trump administration, Saylor was pitching that there should be, the way you get Bitcoin adoption is by having banks adopt Bitcoin so that they can lever up those balance sheets. And therefore, we had the changes so that banks can now create paper Bitcoin. And that was a part of Michael Saylor's pitch of how to get Bitcoin adoption to the next level. So now we have equity capital markets, debt capital markets, full vassalization, and a business plan that is saying, and I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen, that they want to be a Bitcoin-backed bank, i.e. financial weapons of mass destruction. For those of you that are old enough to remember long-term capital management, it's getting closer and closer. What did that get? It got a government bailout because it was too big to fail. So you socialize the losses, privatize the gains. Now, people are speculating on whether this is going to be a government strategy. How did the government strategy work out during the 2008 global financial crisis? They hired BlackRock in order to determine which companies go down and gave everything to Jeffrey Epstein's banker, JP Morgan, took out Jeffrey Epstein's operation with like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, or ones that he was working for previously, when he created this fake persona of being a wealthy financier when he was an intelligence op. And they gave the ETF department of Barclays to BlackRock, using BlackRock's advisory service at the Federal Reserve by printing money, making the taxpayer pay for it, and creating financial weapons of mass destruction. And so did it go to the government? No, it went to the banksters that were creating the mortgage-backed securities and the collateralized debt obligation and the credit default swaps. But what were the credit default swaps? They were meant to be the insurance for the system. But who owned the credit default swaps? BlackRock's pension funds and various other constructs of the financial industrial complex. And so rather than pensioners taking the hit, they used their political lobbying to own, the ETF department of Barclays iShares that gave them all these board seats in the financial industrial complex that they have right now. And they did it with your money through money printing because they are too big to fail. And so that's the second way that they can meet those obligations in the future. It is a tool for the financial industrial complex to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. The more Bitcoin it gets in that wrapper, the more vassalized it is into the financial industrial complex. And people are falling for it. What else could you do? Well, the third way of making up for those additional obligations is selling Bitcoin. So that's beautiful, isn't it? So what did they pivot? They pivoted the terms and conditions saying that it was possible to sell Bitcoin to meet these obligations. What does that do? That creates the ability to utilize paper derivatives, options, financial weapons of mass destruction on strategy shares in order to crash the price so that when you want Bitcoin to be sold, you can sell some of that Bitcoin, which does what essentially Terra Luna did back in the 2021, 2022 days for any of you that were around that back then. And you now have a mechanism for short-term manipulating the price of Bitcoin via a vehicle that is pushing out a narrative that they're taking on JP Morgan. They're taking on the banks. This is vassalization 101 textbook, financial weapons of mass destruction, full subserviency to the financial industrial complex that Satoshi Nakamoto in his original block in 2009, where it was mined into the block, banks on the brink of financial disaster because of the 2008 financial crisis, while Israel was invading Gaza on the front page of that newspaper, it was mined into the block to remind us that this is a resistance against the 2008 global financial crisis with an open source code in order to resist against the money printers. the stock printers, the derivative printers, the bond printers, the crypto printers, the stablecoin printers. And so strategy is a full-blown financial industrial complex, financial weapon of mass destruction to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible so that it is fully submitted to those that are investing in those products. And those investors get to print the money to do it in the first place and can socialize the losses and privatize the gains. And if they want to wipe it out, crash the price of Bitcoin, send it into Chapter 11, and buy all that Bitcoin on the cheap. You think that there's a plan to back the dollar by Bitcoin? Who's in charge? You think the government's in charge? The lobbies are in charge. The lobbies own the Federal Reserve. They're the shareholders of the Fed. They own the government. They own Senate. They own Congress. Through the military industrial complex and the deep state, they can blackmail judicial. That's what Jeffrey Epstein was about. Their whole mechanism is for control. Recognize that we are in a battle for self-custody versus control. That is the battle that we are in, and people don't recognize it because they're investing in the ones that are constructing the things that give more power to the financial industrial complex. How do they do it? Well, they use passive investment funds from your pension. You contribute to your insurance premiums. You contribute to your pension every single month. You put that in BlackRock Bitcoin ETF that gives more power to BlackRock. And then you also end up investing in strategy for tax-deferred income via some of these products as well. And what are they threatening him with right now? Inclusion or exclusion from the NASDAQ 100 index or the S&P 500 index, because no financial market is connected to reality. It is just connected to the ability to receive money from the money printer and get access to these flows of index fund capital that forces buying, which is why BlackRock took over Barclays iShares in the first place. And when they want to do that, they can use their derivatives market, which they're launching more and more products, their structured product market, their hedge funds, their control over media in order to push out narratives, their control algorithm of social media, and all the other financial weapons of mass destruction that the entire Bitcoin community that isn't switched on was engaging in, thinking that they were winning when they were giving more power to the very same attack vector. Hopefully, BitcoinHardTalk investors and people understand these attack vectors because they follow the money, not the narrative. They don't listen to the politicians. What else did we have today? Attack vector 3. Well, you know, the attack vector was if Tether isn't vassalized enough, it basically is now the largest Bitcoin private miner in the world. Now, that's good. It creates a resistance against the public miners that are all going public because they're not vassalized, because they're funded actually by Bitcoin, because they use the US government debt to buy Bitcoin with their yield. But the stable coin through Tether creates an attack vector because you can have the run on the bank that happened to Silicon Valley Bank and happened to USD Circle previously. How do you resist against this? Now, remember, they did an attack on Bitfinex, which is the sister company of Tether. That was 119,000 Bitcoin attack. I became a shareholder, as I said, by supporting the victims of that hack. And where are those Bitcoins right now? Well, they belong to the shareholders and the victims. But what is the US government doing? They're confiscating it, and they're part of the US Bitcoin strategic reserves. And what happened as soon as the Trump administration came through? Well, we ended up with Genius Act to support stable coins. And the person that worked under the PayPal mafia, remember, Palantir, that's doing all these military industrial complex AI weapons through Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk, that's getting all of the data for our social credit score, also had David Sachs, who was part of the PayPal mafia as well. And he brought in Bo Hines. Bo Hines joins Tether and leaves the White House right after creating Genius Act. What did Genius Act do? Well, it basically helped JP Morgan create a covert central bank digital currency, calling it a stable coin because they slipped into the Genius Act that if you have a banking license, you can use your reserves at the Fed to back the stable coin. And there are over $3 trillion of reserves. What else did it do? It said you can compete with other stable coins and pay yield on your stable coin. So you can become a collateralized debt obligation, and then you can pay that yield out to the investor, but only if you have a banking license. And then they create legislation saying you can hold bank on your balance sheet, and that can become part of your asset base in a fiat currency fractional reserve system. And so you have stablecoin issuers are now applying to become banks. One of the companies I invested in was Coinbase and Circle. They were originally Bitcoin companies. Now, because they were subservient to shareholders, they became a shitcoin casino. And then they launched stablecoins. And then they needed to maximize shareholder value. They took on all the Silicon Valley money. The PayPal mafias all came in. And now they're a public company. And in that public company, they're now applying to become a bank. You see the strategy. This is how the complex works. And so what happened? What happens in the Genius Act? It said, while pretending we're not going to have a central bank digital currency, but we don't want people using coin joins, which is how you anonymize private wallets when you hold them in self-custody. And we will take out the developers that created a coin join wallet called Samurai Wallet, and they're going down for 5 years right now, and not much is being talked about that. There's no pardon there. They pardoned Ross Ulbright because they wanted to confiscate the Bitcoin, like they confiscated the Bitfinex Bitcoin, like they just confiscated the Bitcoin from the victims of the scam in Cambodia that China's trying to return to victims, and America said they're on our balance sheet, they're our strategic reserves, rather than return them to victims. So the confiscation strategy is what they are using. But who controls the treasury? The banks, through the bank lobby. So it ain't going to be make America great again. It ain't going to be saving the dollar, because what do the banks want? We'll cover that more in the macro and geopolitical section. What else did they put in the Genius Act? Well, they want to discourage the use of unique wallets via hardware wallets, which are constructed where every time you make a transaction, it creates a new wallet so that you can only be seen for one transaction in this pseudonymous network. They want to make sure that doesn't happen within America. So what is really happening here? Is this the Trump administration ushering in the strategy of the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network that want to have stable coins owned by private corporate interests like JP Morgan and other players that they can bring into the network by taking them public in order to use a gateway drug onto what they're going to be launching in Europe and everywhere else, a central bank digital currency to vassalize those governments up to the private network via stablecoins integrated into Elon Musk's social credit score and Palantir's surveillance state. That they got $500 billion of Stargate capital in order to create and plug into Oracle to get that data. And that's what is happening right now. So they get to buy US Treasury yield. They get to buy Bitcoin with that. And who is the player that is ushering in all these Bitcoin treasury companies and all these borrow against your Bitcoin? Well, of course, it is Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald, who launched a Bitcoin treasury company with a Bitcoiner that got upset that I was talking about this, Jack Mallers. And what did his company do once he took the funding, once he did the partnership? Well, he launched Borrow Against Your Bitcoin. And so you can now put your Bitcoin in custody, borrow against it via Strike. And if the price gets manipulated down, you get margin called and lose your Bitcoin while they're mining fiat currency via these network of financial institutions that are lending them money, which means that those organizations are subordinate to their shareholders and their debt holders. And so now you get more and more Bitcoin-backed loans. You get Cantor Fitzgerald custodying all of the US treasuries behind these stable coins. And what comes out afterwards this week? Attack Vector 3. The S&P, yes, our friends at the S&P, yes, the ones that were rating AAA ratings on the mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations during the 2008 financial crisis, which of course are independent actors, even though some of these credit rating agencies, via various ones that were weaponized, are owned by Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. And so what did they do? They downgraded Tether in order to vassalize it into submission before we go to the next phase of the stablecoin strategy. So now Tether is now being graded with S&P, and it was graded as weak, saying that they had excess reserves held in gold and Bitcoin, while they are engaging in market manipulation through strategy, whilst vassalizing Jack Mallers into the network. And again, nothing of this is about personality. This is structural financial weapons of mass destruction that everyone was promoting this week, except for the Bitcoin Hard Talk listeners that knew a mile off what was happening. And so now they can crash the bond market in order to trigger mass withdrawals, just like they did when Operation Choke Point 2.0 took out Silicon Valley Bank. When Bill Ackman came on Spaces and said, we want the government to bail out the banks after Peter Thiel, yes, Peter Thiel came on Spaces telling all his portfolio companies to withdraw money from Silicon Valley Bank. And Silicon Valley Bank and Signature and Silvergate and Cross Tower, or whatever the other ones were, can't quite remember now, were all vassalized into the network and rolled up into JP Morgan and various other, put into submission by crashing the bond market in order to, and who had a bank account at Silicon Valley Bank? Circle did. And so the depeg happened where Circle's price depegged from the dollar based upon how much money was at Silicon Valley Bank. Now later, the FDIC came in, owned the bank, took over, gave it to their buddies, and then said, okay, we'll guarantee the money paid for by the taxpayer and money printing. And the Federal Reserve constructed another financial weapon of mass destruction in order to take, I think they issued about $650 billion in order to save the system. But banks in Credit Suisse and Morgan Stanley in Switzerland ended up merging, and they managed to use a debt instrument in order to socialize the losses and privatize the gain as well. So what do they want to do? When you dump a stable coin, what did we learn from Terra Luna? Well, it becomes a weapon of mass destruction when you back it by Bitcoin, because then you have to sell the Bitcoin to meet the liabilities, because those US treasuries are meant to be held to maturity. And if they're selling at a discount, that's how you took out Silicon Valley Bank. You sell it at a discount. Now you can no longer meet withdrawal demand. When you need to meet withdrawal demand, you sell some of your Bitcoin and you go through the cascading liquidation cycle of all the people that were borrowing against their Bitcoin, where they get margin called, and who ends up with all the Bitcoin in those treasury companies that essentially, if you want, go into Chapter 11, the lawyers spend them and give them to their VCs and all their buddy network. So what else did Strategy announce? More products. It's going to be offering yield, and it said that it's going to become a bank, just like Barry Silbert did with Genesis when it had its original Bitcoin kind of trust company, different, that depegged from the price of Bitcoin and started trading at a 50% discount to Bitcoin when before it was a premium. And all those companies that were offering yield, where did they get their yield? They got it from the discount and premium to that public company, GBTC, that Barry Silbert created. And then they used that to pay yield by arbitraging these financial weapons of mass destruction. When Terra Luna was taken out, that created cascading liquidations. They are constructing the exact same playbook at the socialize the losses and privatize the gain network. And they were offering, who was offering those Bitcoin-backed loans at the time? BlockFi, Celsius, and all the others. I've been to them many, many times. Vassalization 101, 3 attack vectors. This is financial industrial complex 101, taught to you by somebody that used to work in investment banking, has seen it all, been there, done it, and it's nothing personal, as I said. So please don't take this personal. It is systemic. It is submission. It is blackmail networks. It is financial weapons of mass destruction. Because first, they try and groom you by allowing you to go public or allowing you to take some Silicon Valley money. Then they fund you and your growth, and you become subordinate them because you need the capital, and they lever you up. And then if you don't comply, they blackmail you and they weaponize all sorts of things, whether it be media, whether it be access to financial weapons, whether it be sex blackmail operations. This is what I was trying to explain. And so what I want to do right now is I created a nice AI summary that goes through 2 of those attack vectors, goes through the timeline so that you can recognize what's happening right in front of you right now, based, upon this using strategy and using Jeffrey Epstein and his connection to funding Bitcoin core developers. So you can see how the network works. Right. Let me switch on the sound.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for what is really a high-velocity 2-part investigation.
A really big one.
Yeah, we're looking at Bitcoin's relationship with the established global power structures.
And we're looking both backwards and forwards.
Exactly. We're going backward into the deep and frankly murky past of Bitcoin core funding. And then we're jumping right into the present.
To what looks like a very coordinated institutional pressure campaign
against MicroStrategy, or MSTR. Now, our sources for this deep dive are powerful. They're provocative. We're unpacking a detailed analysis from Simon Dixon.
He's a veteran investor, a real Bitcoin OG.
Mm-hmm.
His report covers the geopolitical and financial angles.
And we're also using the synthesis from Bitcoin University to help tie it all together. Our mission, as always, is to pull out the verified facts.
Right, the grounded structural implications from what can be, very sensational and complex narratives.
So what really stands out here?
I think it's how seamlessly these two things connect, the history and the present day. It just highlights this constant fundamental tension.
That tension between what, exactly?
Now, on one side, you have Bitcoin. It's an infinite, decentralized asset. It's designed to be immune to capture.
By a nation or a corporation.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have this powerful, centralized financial industrial complex, the FIC.
And its goal?
It's always seeking to either manage or co-opt or just neutralize any force that it can't outright crush. This is that story in action.
Okay, so let's unpack that past claim first, because it involves some verifiable details that are, frankly, pretty shocking.
It's a lot to take in.
It centers on new emails. These were released by the House Oversight Committee, and they detail Jeffrey Epstein's involvement with MIT.
Right. So what are the documented facts here? What was his actual financial role when it comes to MIT's digital currency initiative, the DCI?
Well, the connection point, the main one, is Junichi Ito.
He was the director of the MIT Media Lab at the time.
Yes, and the emails confirm that Epstein assisted Ito in funding the Media Lab.
And this is the crucial part. The Media Lab was the institutional home of the Digital Currency Initiative,
whose stated goal, and this is documented, was to provide stable and sustainable funding for long-term Bitcoin core developers.
So this wasn't just some, general funding that went into a big pot.
Not at all. The source outlines a very specific moment. This is in 2015, right after the Bitcoin Foundation collapsed.
Which was its own big controversy.
Exactly, and it created a huge vacuum.
Right, and we have the email from Ito to Epstein. The title is Digital Currency Initiative.
And what does it say?
Ito explains how, after the foundation went bankrupt, all these different organizations were scrambling to take control of the developers.
The developers who were suddenly orphaned financially?
Right. And Ito's team, they secured gifts really quickly. He credits this fast movement for getting developers like Latimer, Gavin, and Corey to join the Media Lab.
And he called it what?
He called it a big win for us. And the email closes with this simple but very telling line to Epstein. It says, use gift funds to underwrite this, which allowed us to move quickly and win this round. Thanks.
Wow. Thanks. That confirms a deeply unsettling connection.
And there's more. We know an Epstein associate, Leon Black, was a major donor to the Media Lab.
And Epstein helped arrange that donation.
He did. And this happened even though MIT had its own explicit policies about, reputational risk for large anonymous donations.
They specifically said their comfort level was below $5 million a year.
Exactly. So this puts Epstein right in the room, orchestrating the money flow to the very institution that then secured foundational Bitcoin talent.
And we know Epstein was interested in the space himself.
Oh, absolutely. That's proven. He discussed Bitcoin with people like Brock Pierce way back in 2015.
Yeah.
He publicly praised it in 2017.
And he even discussed crypto tax and regulation with political actors, right? Like Steve Bannon.
Yes, in 2018. So the interest was clearly there.
Okay, so this brings us to the pivotal question from the analysis. Given this compromised source of funding, did it actually work? Did this arrangement succeed in compromising Bitcoin's integrity, the protocol, the roadmap?
And this is where we have to be surgically precise. We have to separate the verifiable evidence from the powerful narrative that grew out of it.
Okay, so let's start with what is proven.
What is proven is the funding pipeline. Epstein facilitated money to the MIT Media Lab,
Which housed the DCI.
which then funded Bitcoin Core developers. That is a fact. And we also know that the DCI later pivoted.
Pivoted to what?
They started working on highly sensitive CBDC pilots, specifically Project Hamilton and Project Cedar.
So that creates a direct line, at least narratively, from Epstein to Bitcoin Core to state-backed digital currency.
That's the pipeline narrative. It's incredibly compelling.
But what about the compromise itself, the actual code?
That's the key. What is not proven, and the sources are very clear on this, is that Epstein or anyone directing him ever shaped Bitcoin's protocol.
So no influence on the block size debates, for example.
No. There is zero published evidence of direct technical influence on the code itself. None.
So if the code wasn't compromised, why did this narrative become so explosive? Why is it so persistent?
I think it's the moral contamination. It's a vector. It merges three facts that are all true.
Okay, what are they?
1, Epstein funded the institution. 2, the institution funded the developers. 3, that same institution later worked on the very antithesis of Bitcoin central bank digital currencies.
And that overlap just creates this perfect story.
A perfect conspiracy narrative. It's a guilty by association story that suggests the intent was always to co-opt the technology, even if the actual technical capture never happened. The reputational damage alone is the story.
All right, let's shift gears, moving from historical contamination to what feels like current financial warfare.
A very different battlefield.
Let's transition to the drama focused on microstrategy, MSTR, and these powerful institutions like JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley.
Simon Dixon's analysis here suggests a highly aggressive, coordinated institutional strategy is underway, like right now.
And he calls it a structural attack. So what's the central pressure point?
The pressure point is an MSCI consultation. It was announced on October 10th, 2025.
And MSCI, for anyone who doesn't know, they provide the critical global indices that all the big funds track.
Exactly. And they announced they are considering removing companies that hold 50% or more of their assets in digital commodities.
Which is, that is a direct shot at MicroStrategy.
It's the clearest possible target.
So what happens if they actually lose that index eligibility?
It's a disaster for them. Losing it, that means losing mandated institutional passive investment flows.
Pension funds, ETFs that track the index?
All of them. They're forced to sell. It creates a massive overhang on the stock and huge reputational damage.
And the sources frame the timeline that follows this announcement as, what do they call it? An alleged kill shot.
A kill shot, yeah.
Yeah.
Executed by institutions over several months.
Okay, let's unpack that alleged timeline. When did the strategic pressure really begin?
Well, it started long before the index news, actually. Back in May of 2025, you have the notorious short seller Jim Chanos publicly announce his position.
Which was?
Long Bitcoin, short MSTR. And this was a very calculated move.
How so?
It's designed to sow strategic doubt. The message is, the asset is good, but the corporate wrapper holding it is bad.
Okay, so that sets the narrative. Then what?
Then, in July 2025, we see the real financial pressure start. JPM implements a firm-wide margin hike on MSTR shares.
And it was a big one.
Huge. They moved the required collateral from 50% to a really punitive 95%.
And 95% margin requirement, I mean, that makes the stock virtually untradeable for any leveraged fund.
It instantly drains liquidity. It puts immense pressure on any large speculators holding MSTR. You're squeezing the market months in advance.
And then things really started to accelerate around the MSCI news itself.
Right. So in August 2025, JPM was already releasing documents for structured products linked to BlackRock's spot Bitcoin ETF, Hypolecus.
So let me get this straight. You're setting the house on fire with the index risk. You're blocking the exits with the 95% margin hike.
Right.
And at the same time, you're opening a new, expensive hotel across the street, which is the IBIT structured notes.
That's a perfect analogy. And the coordination gets even tighter. Just 4 days after that October 10th MSCI note,
What happens?
Morgan Stanley, which is the former parent company of MSCI, files for its own IBIT-linked security.
So the timeline suggests one arm is creating the fear, the delisting risk, and the other arm is swiftly preparing the bank's own proprietary exit vehicle.
The bank-controlled structured notes, yes.
And according to the sources, this is where it all culminates. The kill shot allegedly happens on November 20th.
On that single day, November 20th, JPM took 2 very specific actions at the same time.
Okay.
First, they published the prospectus they needed to sell their IBIT-linked structured note. And second, they resurrected the 42-day-old MSCI note.
And they didn't just resurrect it.
No, they specifically highlighted the delisting risk to MSTR in their press materials.
Yeah.
The timing it's not random.
But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Are we sure this isn't just shrewd business, reacting to clear market signals?
That's the essential question for impartiality, right?
JPM and Morgan Stanley, they're always optimizing products. Is this truly manipulation or is it just hyper aggressive, sophisticated market timing?
The analysis argues it's the simultaneous nature of the events. Launching your own product on the exact same day you are screaming about your competitor's risk.
That crosses a line.
It crosses the line into what looks like engineered capital migration. The institutional pattern is clear. Use index fear to discredit a company like MSTR.
And then launch your own proprietary bank products, these IBIT notes, to capture the capital that's now fleeing.
Exactly. It's about engineering a migration of capital from a vehicle the FIC can't fully control, which is MSTR, into derivative products the FIC does control, the bank notes.
This alleged manipulation then brings us directly to Simon Dixon's core structural analysis.
It does. It's all about the tension between the infinite nature of Bitcoin and the finite nature of MSTR as a corporate proxy.
Right, and that structural analysis is really the foundation of the sources.
It is. The financial industrial complex controls corporations, not always by managing their day-to-day operations.
But by controlling their strategy.
Yes, specifically through index structures, through credit windows, and crucially through debt, through their debt covenants.
And this is what Dixon calls vassalization.
Vassalization, yes. It implies a forced dependency on the system.
So how does MSTR's structure specifically make it a vassal?
Because MSTR is the finite vehicle. It has to operate on quarterly earnings. It has rigid debt maturities. It needs regular refinancing.
It's playing by Wall Street's rules.
It has to. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is the infinite game. It has no maturity date, no counterparty risk, no refinancing schedules.
And when you look at MSTR's balance sheet, that vulnerability is just laid bare.
Completely. The structural asymmetry is shocking. They have about $54 million in cash versus $700 million in annual financial obligations.
700 million in obligations against 54 million in cash. That is a massive structural shortfall.
It forces their hand.
It absolutely forces them into one of two paths to service that debt.
Right. Either they sell Bitcoin, which would be market suicide for them,
Or they raise more capital,
and every single time they raise more capital, they just increase their dependency on the FIC.
whether it's through more debt covenants that restrict what they can do or more index dependence to make sure they have liquidity.
So the core thesis here is that MSTR is structurally unable to defeat the system because it's completely reliant on the system's tools to even function.
So the FIC doesn't actually benefit from MSTR collapsing entirely.
No, not at all.
They benefit most when MSTR stays alive, but as this highly leveraged proxy.
A proxy that allows the FIC to influence short-term Bitcoin market dynamics. They can create forced selling conditions, for example, using that finite vehicle.
That's the strategic endgame.
It is. Bitcoin itself cannot be disciplined or manipulated by fiat forces. But the corporate wrapper that's holding billions of dollars of Bitcoin, that can be disciplined.
And that's why the conflict is so asymmetrical.
The FIC just needs MSTR to exist as this instrument of short-term influence and as a capital migration vehicle.
And if we look for attempts at resistance, even those just reveal how deep this institutional web goes.
The sources bring up a great example, the case of Jack Mallers, the CEO of Strike.
He got debanked by JP Morgan.
Right. But then who did he partner with? Cantor Fitzgerald and Howard Lutnick.
And Lutnick is described in the sources as Epstein's neighbor for 20 years and a figure who is, deeply involved in those deep state institutional connections.
And this raises a profoundly important point. Cantor Fitzgerald also serves as the main custodian for all of Tether's vast holdings of U.S. Treasuries.
So the analysis suggests that trying to fight the financial industrial complex by using corporate wrappers or by just switching partners from JPM to Cantor Fitzgerald.
That is not true resistance.
Yeah.
It's just switching which highly centralized, interconnected institutional partner you happen to be dependent upon.
Which brings us all the way back to you, the listener. If all these corporate proxies are potentially vulnerable to this vassalization, what is the real form of resistance? What's available to the individual who's trying to get out of this finite game?
Well, the final synthesis, I think, is just clarity on what the battlefield actually is.
Okay.
While the short-term market will always be pressured by the FIC using these finite vehicles like MSTR, the long-term, multi-year trajectory of Bitcoin is ultimately unmanipulable.
The fiat markets, the central banks, they can only create short-term volatility and noise.
That's it.
So this structural reality, it recalibrates the entire battle. The real fight is not institutional versus institutional.
No, it is, as Simon Dixon outlines in his analysis, derivative, money, stock, crypto, and bond printers versus Bitcoin and self-custody.
We don't beat the FIC by investing in their products or by using their system's proxies.
You beat it by exiting the finite game entirely.
Absolutely. The FIC thrives on manipulating these finite games that have maturity dates and counterparty risks. Bitcoin rewards the infinite game players.
Those who prioritize structural independence. So I guess that leaves a provocative closing thought for you to explore.
Sit here.
If your goal is to win the long-term infinite game, is your most effective strategy just to exit the finite game entirely?
Meaning you prioritize self-custody of your assets.
And you actively avoid all of these Wall Street wrappers, whether that's MSCR shares or structured notes or any other form of institutional dependence. Is that the only real way to win?
And hopefully you can understand the whole purpose of this was to help people recognize that we had an attack trying to connect Jeffrey Epstein to Bitcoin core development. And anyone that doesn't understand this stuff will think that, Bitcoin of Jeffrey Epstein, at the same time as a coordinated attack from people that have historically attacked Bitcoin, like Barry Selbert, who's a long-term investor and will willingly buy back as much Bitcoin as it can get on the cheap in order to put as much fear, uncertainty, and doubt around Bitcoin while pushing Zcash, because they want you to sell your Bitcoin. And they weaponized just this week alone what I've been warning people about for a long, long time now. They weaponized strategy, they weaponized Tether, they weaponized Bitcoin-backed loans via Strike, and the financial industrial complex. They want to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. Stable coins are the gateway drug to central bank digital currencies. So right in the beginning of this, we talked about the connections between CIA and Bitcoin. We said that the resistance was that it became open source and therefore there was no backdoor to it. But what did it become? It either became a honeypot, which is what most people are fearing. They're thinking it's going to suddenly swipe your Bitcoin, that there's a backdoor. That's the uneducated analysis. The reality is Bitcoin is a gateway drug to stable coins and central bank digital currencies. And the people that you are potentially idolizing right now are the ones that are being utilized knowingly or unknowingly by the financial industrial complex in order to get you into that gateway drug, which means that it's easy. What is the solution here? You fight back with Bitcoin in self-custody. You boycott Bitcoin ETFs so that you don't empower BlackRock and the other FIC players. You boycott Bitcoin treasury companies and you boycott Bitcoin-backed loans so that you don't get subjected to the margin calls. You don't use Bitcoin leverage so that you don't actually have any Bitcoin. You have just a financial weapon of mass destruction instead. And you'll sit back and relax as a long-term investor, owning more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, aligning with the people that want your Bitcoin, getting it on the cheap when they do these manipulative short-term strategies, because you're never going to out-trade the financial industrial complex, but you can certainly invest in order to win. And that simplifies your life to focus on the more important things in life. And so what we're going to be doing for the rest of the show is we're going to be going into how Jeffrey Epstein manipulates and has been utilized in order to manipulate macro markets, use market manipulation, and then the geopolitical implications as well. And we're going to be covering the deep connections in terms of why are we getting these Jeffrey Epstein email links? What's the connection to Trump? And what do I think is happening here, so that you can actually make better decisions and prepare accordingly, because this is all about preparation based upon what seems to be coming next. So let's connect a few more dots. Right. Now, if you're a long-term listener of Bitcoin Hard Talk, let's review quickly. You'll know that we entered into a new era after the global financial crisis and COVID and various other operations, when the US stock market was no longer connected to the fundamental value of a company. In fact, it became based upon three weapons, or three forces, let's call them. The first is money printing, which is reallocating money printing in the K-shaped economy to those that own stocks via the debt markets. The corporations that are able to borrow at the lowest rate are able to get an advantage, and the financial industrial complex wants to vassalize you into stock dependency by allowing you to borrow against your stock, which means that you become subordinate to the money printing of the Federal Reserve, which always increases in order to pump up the value of those stocks in that K-shaped economy, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. You get a K-shaped stock market where more and more value goes towards those larger stocks, and you control the inflow of capital via the second weapon, which is index passive flows. And so by determining which companies are in indexes, ratings agencies and inclusion in receipt to passive flows becomes a tool you can use, and you can send out your hedge fund network. And the weaponization of tool 3, which is market capture through algorithms and media capture as well. So by controlling the narrative, then you can just decide which companies do you keep and which companies do you let go. And which ones keep are not based upon anything to do with an America First agenda, a UK First agenda. It's actually geopolitical strategic significance in the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network, negotiating strategic tensions via the government so that they can control choke points to end up with more value in those stock prices. And that's what's happening right now. So people are talking about the AI bubble, but these are geopolitical strategic that are going to be the recipients of money printing, index funds, media manipulation, i.e. you've got to pump all your money into us, otherwise China will win the AI race, and then also controlling of the algorithms through artificial intelligence that we're seeing right now. That is what the stock price is based upon, because it's no longer any resemblance to a free market. And so the tools that we've always talked about is that you can either groom politicians in order to have control over the political process. You can use lobbying in order to take corporate budgets and make sure Senate, Congress is in your favor. And you can also create blackmail networks, which weaponizes several reputation and all sorts of other things in order to ensure subordination whether that be at the judicial level or whether that be at any of the other levels of influence, including monarchies, including prime ministers, including presidents, including tech billionaires, including anyone that controls some of those choke points as well. So basically, the Epstein files are now being used as a weapon in order to make sure that things are moving in the direction that the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex want them to go. So remember, the group that I believe, and this is my speculation, possesses the Epstein files is not the government. It's actually accelerating the decline of the West right now. And so all of the civil unrest campaigns that you're witnessing, all of the capital outflows, all of the strategic weakening of the dollar that you're experiencing right now, all of the fiscal dominance is the financial industrial complex, which actually has a slightly different vision to other factions of power, like the military industrial complex, because the military is a bit more aligned with a nationalistic agenda historically. Now it's gone into more technical artificial intelligence, cybersecurity warfare. But this is what I believe my long-term theory in Bitcoin Hard Talk is what we're seeing on the geopolitical and macro side. And so what the Epstein files are being used right now is pushing partnerships and reminding everyone that capital outflows are meant to go to the East and money printing needs to be used just for propping up the dollar in the K-shaped economy, while civil unrest campaigns happen across the West. And we had shootings with White House defense members. That leads to ICE, privatized prison and military going out. And then based upon that, you get the surveillance state, the Palantir, the private, and that was open border, closed border operations as well. But what is it all doing? It is weakening the dollar, pumping up the stock market through fiscal dominance, and pushing negotiations in capital further out to the east to the regional blocks like BRICS and the Gulf countries. And so this is ensuring that everybody is getting behind that plan. Now, what's the civil unrest campaign that your algorithms are feeding you? I've talked about it before. If you are on one side of the algorithm, you will believe that Jews rule the world, the Jewish conspiracy theory, Zionists and Israel rules the world, Netanyahu is the top of the power structure, and your algorithm will be feeding you all of that information to back up that belief. If you are on the other side, you will be being fed that Qatar rules the world, they're buying up everything, the Muslims are invading, they're going to take over, they're going to all have children, there's a white genocide, and Muslims are taking over, and Arabs are taking over, and Muslims are, all of this, that on the algorithm. Now, what is important about that? There's actually elements of truth, because the birth rates in Israel, in Islam, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, and in Africa, these tend to be black and brown and Arab countries. They're having the highest birth rates, while everyone else is not having the birth rates right now. So you're being fed the narrative that artificial intelligence is taking your job. Many of those jobs are going over to those different regions. This is creating the capital outflows. It's weakening the dollar, as we're seeing from the capital flows right now. And then the asset stripping operation is happening across the West. And then they're weaponizing those algorithm and media in order to manufacture hate, while they do many of the colored revolution covert operations that they used to do in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa. They're now doing them at home. So you're seeing more and more violence. And of course, what happened with the White House shooting, it was blamed on Afghan, even though that Afghan worked for the CIA in Afghanistan, which was an operation when the Taliban wanted to close the drug routes and the CIA wanted to open up those drug routes, while they're pretending they're coming after the drug cartels in Venezuela and various other things. But anyway, the group that controls the Jeffrey Epstein files, I believe, is leveraging to achieve basically military industrial complex, foreign policies, where the next wars will be, where they'll make up for lost profits, and then making sure that everyone's on track with that in case they go off track. And I believe that this is the same group that is basically leveraging the files. And so, what are the connections there? The politicians are like the battering ram. They're on the front line. Their job is to implement the policy of their lobby, create an acceptable narrative to make you believe it's in your favor, and get the blame when it goes wrong, so that you're pointing at the Democrats and the Republicans and the left and the right and the Jews and the Muslims and the LGBTQs and all the different narratives that they're manufacturing in these civil unrest campaigns. But the goal is to achieve the largest capital realignment that we've ever seen in a century. The biggest capital realignment was the Bank of England transition to the Federal Reserve via World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, and the gold confiscation. But this is basically a complete migration of capital into the global south. And you're seeing that reflected in the relative strength of the various stock markets. And so money is going into the global south and the Arab world. Those stock markets are outperforming, while the American stock market is just popped up by government printing, crony capitalism, and the three forces: manipulation of media, index funds, and money printing. So money printing continues is the general macro thesis. We've gone from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, and you don't want that debt to be refinanced at market rate. So Trump's making sure that the rate goes down, and they'll be dumping it through stable coins and deregulation of pension funds, so that you can subsidize at below inflation rates as they try to inflate away the debt through fiscal dominance. So all of this, I believe, is weaponized as a macro tool in order to control capital flows, as well as the geopolitical things that we'll be covering right now under the Trump administration. So it's all about access to capital. We covered in the section in Bitcoin, the vassalization strategies of companies. Also, we've covered in previous episodes how through lobby finance, you control Congress and Senate, and through blackmail operations, you can also gain influence over judicial as well. Also, you want to gain access over fiscal policy, which is what Trump's doing, fiscal dominance for the banks. So it looks like a narrative of we're taking down the Fed, but all the tools of monetary policy are still there, with the final rollover of fiscal policy while having complete control. And that is what we're moving towards: asset stripping, using the dollar while engineering the hedging strategy of pushing capital outflows. At the same time, who's buying those assets? Well, it's foreign direct investment. So you've got the private equity industry that is buying assets into weakness. You got venture capital, which is doing some of those acquisitions into the larger companies. You've got all of the different financial weapons of mass destruction in order to control macro forces and control market forces. You're getting more and more people needing to rebalance at the end of the year. But it's no longer business, in the West. It's just as function of the proof of weapons network and geopolitical significance in these negotiations that are happening right now. And so if you want to make sure that Trump is in power, then you slowly leak out some of the Epstein emails. If you see Trump as some kind of, in this transition, imagine you're military and you want predictability, which is backing the dollar by death, destruction, war and violence, covert operations, and forced IMF debt enslavement. Then you're going through a bit of a regime change right now. And there may be people in the network that are lower down in Senate and Congress that may not have figured out what the money is saying right now. And so, corporate companies want to make sure that regulations are being utilized in order to support monopoly power right now. You want to make sure that tariff policies are being utilized in order to make sure that the capital comes into the large organizations while the small businesses are paying the import tariff, and the export-driven countries, they're being merged and acquisitions up to the top. You want to make sure that within all these countries, your technology is being used. Your Palantir surveillance, your contracts for digital ID, your stable coins, your central bank digital currencies. You want to make sure that everyone's still on agenda with all the levers and all the power that you can muster up. And despite basically, Trump is basically doing, I think, everything that his backers have asked him to do. You want to make sure that that leverage is going out there and everyone knows who they're working for and what this needs to be moving. Maybe someone's allocating capital in the wrong direction. And so you want to get leverage over some of those donor classes and push out in this civil unrest campaign, that we're seeing. You want to deconstruct NATO. You want to use it in the right direction so that all the euros are going into the US stock market. You want to make sure that the deep state is losing some of what propped up the dollar, like USAID, and that reduces those capital flows, and it stops countries being dependent on US aid. Then they start to negotiate and look at alternative capital routes, and hopefully they start working on their own sovereign strategies. Simultaneously, Trump says we're going to invade Nigeria because they're killing the Christians. Basically, that brings them into don't work with the destabilized America, work with China, who's also going to be investing. And so you can see these capital flows are really pushing people through. And maybe sometimes Trump is a wild card. So you need to leak a little bit further, weaken some of his voter base, split the factions. And maybe, they're seeing him that he's, you can use that in order to weaken a little bit more. And so what are the tools that I'm seeing being used? Obviously, NATO funding. We're seeing hesitations around Ukraine. We're seeing trade hostility. We're seeing major triggers in volatility, which are, doing more and more centralization. We're seeing files being leaked around CIA's connection to January the 6th. There was a colored revolution at home. Then you're seeing these deployments of ICE military. And either way, it works in their favor. You either get people to comply because you've got these radicalized people that are part of those private military operations, or you get revolutions and shootings against it. When you have the revolutions, you have the justification to bring in more surveillance, more digital ID, and just taking away more and more of those constitutional protections by classifying more and more groups as terrorists. So you then classify your internal American militias as terrorists, and therefore you don't have any due process. We're starting to see more and more people arrested. I remember Sammy Handy, he came to America. It's basically saying, don't come to America. He was arrested via Laura Loomer's network, who basically had relationships with Homeland Security into those privatized ICE networks. And it was only because he had a large social media following that he was able to use his influence, but he was detained for approximately 18 days. But all the other people that he met in prison, he said, and came out, that they've been stuck there for months and for no reason, because what they do is they delay the judicial process by keeping them and locking them up in those prisons. And then when it gets to the judicial process, it's unconstitutional, so they get out in the end. But they're able to arbitrage these different things as part of the civil unrest campaigns. It also creates more institutional distrust, so that people are saying, I don't want to invest in these companies. You're seeing more and more judicial, changes, more and more uncertainty, more and more belief in constitutional protections. But in the end, I don't think that the Proof of Weapons Network is trying to use the Jeffrey Epstein files to destroy Trump, because Trump's doing everything that they want. But there is an internal faction that I'll be covering more in the geopolitical side. And so I just think they want to weaken him and just get enough policy continuity so that he can move forward in the manner that he has been, going through at the moment. And so we're seeing just this small leak of files. Now, what is it actually achieving? Well, who was the military industrial complex aligned with? That's mainly the evangelical Christians that aligned with Zionism. And so Zionism is about weaponizing religion for the forever war model. And the forever war model is about destabilizing the Middle East. And so if you are trying to remove some legitimacy from the evangelical Christians, then you take things like weaponizing sexual, child, and the atrocities that I won't say. And so that gives more legitimacy from the voters that are aligned to the evangelical and Zionist side, at the same time as many of the media platforming people like Nick Fuentes that's driving these white nationalist types of movements that's pushing more and more civil unrest, but driving people more and more to this divorce with Zionism that we're seeing right now. And it splits MAGA. And therefore, it takes those different groups that may be other factions of power in this controlled divorce that's happening right now, are moving in these types of games that they're trying to influence. And so these are the types of games that I think we're seeing right now. And more of those conservative blocks might be looking for, well, I can't invest in Trump. Now we can go back to the midterm elections and you can distract everybody with left versus white. The radical Democrats are going to take over. The Epstein Files, when Trump was fighting back, he connected it to various, that is a Democrat hoax. But in all, the mass corruption of the system is really, really being shown. The emperor has no clothes. This is strategically weakening the dollar. It's exposing that there is an elite class, an elite, power structure within America that we call and have exposed with the Proof of Weapons Network. Other people, you have all these different types of moral hypocrisy. How can you be supporting Trump when he's connected to these types of things? They're not aligned with evangelical Christian values. And all of these different things of the weaponization of religion that we're seeing right now. Because all in all, I think the Proof of Weapons Network prefers to have reputational damage as opposed to major confrontation. And when they want to move to major confrontation, they can push on some of these civil unrest campaigns that we're witnessing across the country and across the West. But it's creating maximum leverage. And Trump's not going to be able to rebuild that trust. Now, obviously, he gets that last election, and they're laying the foundation for who they want in charge next time. We all know that J.D. Vance was groomed by Peter Thiel, and he was funded via Peter Thiel, and he's aligned with the technical industrial complex and some of those different Zionist factions as well. So you can really see the power struggle at the top that's being weaponized right now. And so all of this Epstein Files kind of just changes the conversation, like into character integrity, which is basically the evangelical Christians, those segments as well. So you can see where they are trying to get this right now. His base is kind of, at the moment, if you look at people, it's getting smaller and smaller. They're tolerating corruption. They're tolerating aggression. They're tolerating chaos at the moment. But many of them are like, well, we don't tolerate child abuse. And so you're seeing more of that in the algorithm as well, in these associations. It's basically politically radioactive. There's no justifying it. You basically lose the value conservative base that splits the factions as well. And you can get ready for the, influencing the political process. So basically, who actually controls these Epstein files? I don't know the exact answer to it, but I think the way that they're actually being used is it is this intersection between factions of global finance, many of the defense supply chains in the military industrial complex. There's some in the intelligence network. They have access to different parts of the information, it seems. It's also the ones that are coming from foreign sovereign wealth as well. And some of the media conglomerates as well. And some of the transnational lobbying that comes through these different factions of power. And just so people are asking, people say that it's obviously connected to Zionism, which is that faction of power. But if you've watched my blog on Is It the Jews, you'll know that it's controlled by shareholders, and shareholders change based upon wealth. But there is an inbuilt Jewish conspiracy in there so that when America wants to manage its divorce, it can use that for its scapegoating, because there's elements of truth in there, Jewish aligned power in there. But they are from an absolute range of backgrounds, but spaces are out there just saying how everything is Qatar or everything is the Jews. And so that's built into the process. And you're seeing, Jew hatred become a real thing, a revival. And I think the algorithms is doing it. And Muslim hatred, that's being, the algorithms are reviving it as well. And you've got, different types of people connected to the Epstein files, like Trump, Elon Musk, and various others that are being part of that. But anyway, who actually controls it? Well, it is the elite class of shareholders, which comes from different factions of power. They all hold leverage over everybody. This is how the process works at the Proof of Weapons Network. Some people want to say it's an organized cabal. It's actually a decentralized network of shareholders and wealth that are there to control more. And if you don't comply with the network, you get knocked off the network. That involves political power, minister power, all types of high levels of different types of power. And what are they doing? They're using Epstein and other operations. This is just one of them, in order to accumulate leverage so that everyone has some kind of liability in order to comply with this network. It's basically people that have, there's a bunch of people that are all enemies of each other, but they know that they're all exposed into these reputation tarnishing operations. And so they kind of all form alliances, which I believe keeps the network together. And it's connected deeply to the drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, sex trafficking rings that funds all the black op operations, that props up the military industrial complex, that props up the dollar, that is ultimately controlled by the financial industrial complex, that then can use weaponization of these different corporate entities. And they can use them to break alliances, push alliances, participate in some of the, as part of the network, they force you into some of the gray areas in terms of ethics. It's basically, you have to, you can be connected to these different things and make sure that you are interacting with these different intelligence services and networks. Information is basically a currency that I think is used in many of these currency wars and these information wars. Nobody that climbs to power is clean. The higher you up in the echelon of power, the more dirty you are, because nobody clean is allowed to make it up. You can't be underexposed. You have to be overexposed, particularly when you get to the presidential side as well. And the more you've been involved with in your background, the more perfect you are for the role. At the level of these very, very high power structures, you basically have more and more of these control systems, and they're built into these different types of networks. And that's what I think the Jeffrey Epstein network is. And ultimately, it was a dollar dominant strategy through these covert wars in order to utilize the stock market, create that K-shaped economy. And at some stage, the financial industrial complex wants to realign the order like they did from the British to the American Empire. And that's a multipolar world that I think we're moving into right now. And so what did you see in many of these different leaks? So you start everything to do with elite families, whether it be the Brits, whether it be the monarchy, whether it be, different people to weaken the US and the West, whether it be some of the GCC Gulf country ruling families, whether it be factions of power within China, which is obviously ruled by the China Communist Party. So you don't have the corporate charge at top. But they try to penetrate these different things, even if it's Russia's oligarchs. Where do you think Putin came from in the first place? He was fighting back against the Russian oligarchs that were privatizing Russian resources for Western blocs through neoliberal, privatization campaigns. And even the Europe and their finance aligned, different circuits and power that you see across the historical European banking elites as well. But anyway, the further you go up the stack, basically, the more everybody is vassalized and compromised. Everyone has to have something. Everybody knows that everyone else has something. And so you create this self-reinforcing network, which creates a level of stability in the proof of weapons network and the ability to knock people off if they don't comply. Because basically mutual exposure means that you have mutual compliance with the proof of weapons network is how I think all this works. No single actor can initiate like a major betrayal without knowing that they're going to be targeted as well. So it's like a shared darkness as a form of governance. And you need to believe that you just need to engage in the political process. And just so you know, I kind of understand this from being an investor in over 100 different companies, being a part of the proof of weapons network and financial industrial complex within the investment banking sphere, leaving in order to educate at universities when I had many, many attacks from London School of Economics, University College of London, Birkbeck University, Chicago University, when I was giving those monetary reform presentations. And then trying to create a bank and realizing what you have to do to build a bank that wasn't allowed to launch. And then I ended up going to the Bitcoin conference, investing in many companies and seeing the journey of a Bitcoin aligned company that ends up something like Coinbase, where you're applying to become an actual bank. And having seen all that journey, and fortunately, this is the very same reason why we basically ended up selling, or I'm selling most of my private equity and moving it to sovereign Bitcoin and self-custody. This is why we never took Silicon Valley funding as a strategic decision and ended up putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet, not to lever it up and borrow against it, but to remain sovereign from Silicon Valley. It's why we ended up, as we had to get more and more regulations, we ended up selling our broker-dealer to Coinbase, who's now utilizing that in order to engage in BlackRock's vision of tokenized everything, tokenized securities, tokenized real-world assets, tokenized carbon credit scores that is going to be utilized in the end, obviously, combined with the social credit score and the stable coins. This is why I don't borrow against my Bitcoin, because once I do, the banks have got you. This is why we use Bitcoin as a treasury rather than Silicon Valley. This is why in my journey, we avoided going public, because once you go public, you are forced into a vassalization strategy for the FIC. And this is basically why, the Epstein Files is not an anomaly. This is why there are other operations. This is why Trump had to talk about pardoning P. Diddy. This is why Trump had to talk about moving Ghislaine Maxwell, who's connected with Jeffrey Epstein. It is literally the infrastructure of how the proof of weapons network works, which owns the West right now, And that's why we're seeing the decline of the West, because it's managed from within this financial industrial complex as well. It's a leverage mechanism. It's a vassalization strategy. All public companies are subjected to the same strategy as soon as you go public. They force you into compromise and compliance and debt. And being clean basically removes any of their leverage. So they have to do a blackmail operation if you're too clean. They need to bring you in. And there's always a way of bringing you in. The elites never want to remove any of that leverage because they know how dirty the games that they're involved with at the top. They want to always control that leverage. The only difference is that they have, a less exploitable liability than the people, than the politicians that they're actually targeting for the manipulation. And the more they've got on you, the better it is, because basically exploitation requires access, and all access is based upon your ability to, if you can defy outsiders. And that's what I'm saying. And this is why I try to share around these different micro strategies. This is why I try and share that this is structural. This is not personal. This is exactly how the system works. And so with that in mind, that's what I wanted to share on the macro section. And I'm going to turn over now to a video so that you can see the geopolitical chains. I'm going to combine it with Trump's history and how he entered into this proof of weapons network. I'm going to show some of the things that they're strategically leaking right now, and what it means that Trump actually signed off on releasing the Epstein Files, and how it was structured so that you can see the geopolitical weapons that are being used and the lawfare that's being used right now. So with that in mind, I'm going to play the final video, which is the longest video. And this is going to be the geopolitics behind Epstein.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know the drill. We take the most complex information, all those threads that everyone else seems to ignore, and we try to weave them into a clear narrative. And today, we are wading deep into a story that is just so much bigger than sex or scandal or even celebrity.
Yeah, really.
We're talking about the recent massive releases of the Jeffrey Epstein files, but we're going to be looking at them through a very specific, very high stakes geopolitical lens.
Exactly. I mean, if you think this is just some moral outrage or, a simple partisan political story, you are completely missing the forest for the trees.
Right.
So our mission here is really to synthesize the framework developed by Bitcoin OG investor and geopolitical analyst Simon Dixon. We're essentially doing an intensive deep dive to create a kind of audio summary of his analysis.
An audio summary for his live stream, BitcoinHardTalk. That's the goal.
That's it. In his framework, he calls it the proof of weapons network. It just cuts through all the noise, and it explains the crucial question. Why? Why are these files being released now?
And what greater war are they instruments of?
Precisely.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, this isn't just a political leak. Dixon frames it as a critical, calculated move in a high-stakes global power struggle. And the question on everyone's mind is pretty simple. Is Donald Trump blackmailed?
And Dixon argues that to truly answer that, you have to just abandon the whole illusion of independent political figures.
Okay.
And instead, you have to understand the fundamental system that creates, and more importantly, controls politicians globally. That's the proof of weapons network.
So this network, it's structured around a single operating principle then?
A single principle.
No.
No government, no politician, and no industry leader should ever be truly sovereign. If that's sovereignty, if it conflicts with the combined interests of corporate power and intelligence agencies.
So how do they ensure that? How do they ensure that subordination?
Well, they use a three-pronged approach.
The first step is the simplest and I guess the most patient one. They invest in and they actively groom politicians, right?
Yeah.
Early in their careers.
Very early. They spot promising figures. They make sure they rise through the ranks, often by providing that initial funding, the right connections.
So it creates a sort of psychological and financial reliance from the very start.
It does. So the second tool is just massive, undeniable financial influence.
Campaign financing.
Monumental campaign financing. They buy political loyalty, channeling it strategically through these sophisticated lobby groups, political action committees. You know the deal. It ensures that every decision made aligns with the network's corporate or military interests.
And then there's the third tool, the one that guarantees absolute non-negotiable compliance regardless of public opinion or personal ethics.
And that's where this all comes in. That's the creation and maintenance of leverage.
That's blackmail.
It's blackmail. And that, in a nutshell, is the ultimate insurance policy. It's the whole network of compromise that this entire Epstein saga really represents.
Okay, so to preview our structure for you today, we're first going to establish this massive geopolitical conflict that's underway. I mean, the fundamental misalignment between the world's major power complexes that forms the backdrop for these weaponized file releases.
Right. And then we'll narrow our focus. We'll look at Donald Trump's history, examining the specific corrupt environment of New York real estate that really forged him and made him vulnerable, or maybe more accurately, predictable.
Predictable to this network, what the Associated Analysis calls his Zionist ball and chain.
Exactly. And then finally, we'll analyze the recent file disclosures, all 20,000 documents, not as random documents dropped in some civil suit, but as a strategically managed, highly partisan political tool.
A tool used by the network to enforce discipline on its assets during this global transition.
That's the framework.
Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack this proof of weapons network by identifying its major components. Dixon's framework, it defines three primary industrial complexes of power that the network is constantly trying to weaponize or balance or control.
Right. You've got the technical industrial complex, or TICIX,
The ticket.
then the financial industrial complex, the FIC, and of course, the one everyone knows.
The military industrial complex, the MIC.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is really understanding the dynamic between these massive forces. Because traditionally, for the better part of the last 50 years, let's say, the FIC, the TIC, and the MIC have been, largely aligned,
Working together.
working in concert to maintain U.S. global hegemony, the existing world order. But, and this is the key point in Dixon's analysis,
Yeah.
right now, they are profoundly misaligned,
Misaligned.
caught in a high-stakes conflict specifically over this rapid global transition that's pushing us really toward a multipolar world order.
So we have a clear and present power struggle. The goals of these three titanic groups are starting to diverge, fundamentally.
They are.
Okay, let's start with the faction that's fighting to maintain the status quo, the military industrial complex, the MIC. What do they want, and what's their strategy for getting it?
The MIC's goal is, well, it's pretty straightforward. Prop up the US dollar through the forever war model. I mean, the dollar's global reserve status is inextricably linked to the petrodollar system, right? And that relies on the US military's ability to enforce the global oil trade in dollars.
So to sustain that, the MIC needs continuous global conflict, perpetual instability.
It's the business model.
So how is that instability engineered on a global scale?
Well, their key node in this network, according to the analysis, is the use of certain political ideologies, specifically Zionism. The claim is that this ideology is weaponized to maintain a state of conflict and radicalization across religious demographics.
Which in turn justifies continuous military operations and spending in vital regions.
That's the mechanism.
Okay, let's unpack that weaponization mechanism a bit more, just laying out what the source material is claiming here because it's a highly sensitive topic.
It is. The analysis claims it operates by creating these radicalized proxy forces that just maintain the conflict. So, for instance, it suggests it's used to radicalize Christian groups, particularly evangelicals, by promoting a political interpretation of Scripture, one that asserts they must unconditionally protect the state of Israel as a political entity. And the result of that is just massive domestic political pressure for continued U.S. military support and intervention.
And on the other side of that conflict.
The analysis also posits that this framework weaponizes Jewish groups by using the narrative of existential protection to justify the massive military machine, the IDF, which in turn acts as a destabilizing force in the Middle East.
Okay.
And furthermore, the analysis points out that the resulting conflicts are then used to simultaneously weaponize the ideology of Islam against itself, funding proxy conflicts through covert intelligence operations.
And the sources specifically mention things like the funding of CIA and Mossad operations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Yes, whose purpose, according to the analysis, is solely to create chaos and destabilization.
And that chaos is the key, isn't it? Because these destabilization campaigns are crucial for gaining access to and control over resources in the Middle East, oil, strategic minerals, you name it.
All while ensuring the dollar remains the undisputed medium for weapons and resource trade.
The MIC thrives on this volatility.
Absolutely. So now let's pivot sharply to the other side of this conflict. You've got the FIC, the financial industrial complex, so the major banks, global investors, and the TIC, the technical industrial complex, the big tech players, AI developers, data giants.
And they want the exact opposite of perpetual war.
The complete opposite. Their strategic goal is to usher in a multipolar world to facilitate this necessary transition towards de-dollarization and, paradoxically, to achieve regional stability.
Particularly in the Middle East.
Yes, that stability is required for the next phase of global financial engineering. And this is where we see Epstein's original utility coming into focus.
Okay, connect those dots.
This is where the network's internal logic really shows itself. Epstein was fundamentally used to gain leverage over the FIC and the TUC,
The financial donor class.
the immense financial donor class, and the big tech titans. The network, which was reported initially by figures like Lex Wexner, was focused on controlling this wealth and technology class by gathering compromising material.
And we know this control mechanism was effective. I mean,
Yeah.
you just have to look at the massive financial consequences we've already seen.
That's a key point. This
Yeah.
isn't just allegations anymore, it's adjudicated settlements. You have institutions like JP Morgan settling for $290 million.
Deutsche Bank also made significant settlements.
Right. That level of financial consequence, it just doesn't happen unless there is undeniable, deeply compromising material held against the highest echelons of the financial industry.
So the network compromised them. But now that same faction, the fictic, has a larger strategic imperative, which is stability.
Stability to facilitate the global financial transition.
Hmm.
And they are pushing hard for normalization in the Middle East.
Right. This faction supports normalizing relations across the board. We already saw that major diplomatic victory that was secured by China, brokering the normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
A huge step.
So the next crucial step in this multipolar shift is normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
And this is where the fictic's interests directly conflict with the MIC's perpetual war model.
Yeah.
Because Saudi Arabia, backed by the rising influence of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, has laid down a very clear, massive requirement for normalization with Israel.
And that is the acceptable resolution of the Palestinian cause.
Yes, which means Israel must fundamentally stop ethnic cleansing and allow for a viable Palestinian state.
That, on its face, just completely undercuts the MIC's entire strategy.
It totally does. This transition fundamentally removes the utility of the U.S. military as the dominant, destabilizing external leverage in the region. It allows the GCC nations to gain greater autonomy and control over their own assets.
Which leads inevitably to a major U.S. exit from the region, regional stability.
And, critically, it allows the GCC nations and the fictic to initiate what Simon Dixon calls a distressed acquisition of key regional assets. Assets they currently can't access or control because of U.S. military dominance.
Okay, so if the FIC and the TIC want stability to execute this global financial pivot, and the MIC wants chaos to maintain dollar dominance, what happens when they're mutually compromised assets like Donald Trump, who took funding from all sides, right? The FIC, the Titterack, the MIC.
He took it from the Mellon banking family, from Elon Musk, from Miriam Adelson.
What happens when they start to sway?
And that brings us to the core weaponization thesis. Because the MIC and the fictic are misaligned during this transition, the Epstein Files become the most potent tool imaginable.
They're a weapon.
A weapon. The files are not being released randomly. They're being strategically leaked by forces affiliated with the MIC. The analysis specifically names Netanyahu and Israel as key allies in this strategy to blackmail and to force members of the FIC and TITIC into compliance.
This is an internal pressure campaign on a massive scale.
Exactly. The leaks gain additional leverage and are designed to ensure everyone, including political figures like Trump, stays precisely on track during this inevitable but highly volatile shift to a multipolar world.
So the political game that we're all watching play out in Washington is just a dramatic front for this much deeper corporate and intelligence negotiation.
That's the theory.
We've established the massive geopolitical conflict, this war between global stability and perpetual war. Now let's shift our focus from that macro environment down to the micro environment that created and compromised one of the most powerful people caught in this web, Donald Trump. And this section draws heavily on the Ryan Dawson documentary summary, which is called Trump's Zionist Ball and Chain.
Right. And to understand why a figure like Trump is considered a predictable asset rather than, some unpredictable rogue, you have to understand the foundational environment he came from.
New York and New Jersey real
The
estate.
development world there. The sources describe it not just as a dirty business, but as a cesspool of organized crime and corrupt pay-to-play government.
That's a pretty strong assessment.
It is, but the context is crucial here. In this specific world of state contracts and massive urban development, things like bribery and blackmail, they aren't shocking ethical lapses.
They're standard practice.
They're standard business practices.
Yeah.
The normal cost of doing business, of securing state licenses. You don't pay for access, you pay for guaranteed results.
And there's even a quote that illustrates this perfectly, where a political consultant just admitted, in New Jersey, you contribute money not for access, but for results. Anybody who doesn't admit that is lying.
So blunt.
So the foundation of his career was built inside a pre-existing machine of just transactional corruption.
Absolutely. And this machine, the analysis notes, is heavily influenced and often dominated by a cabal of Zionist ideologues who actively use their immense wealth to further Israeli regime interests.
Influencing American money, media, and most importantly,
Military power. This is the cesspool that both Trump and Jared Kushner mastered.
So the marriage of Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner was, in a way, a geopolitical event as much as a family one.
You could see it that way. It was a unification of two massive wings of this compromised NYNJ real estate power structure. And this brings the Kushner family's playbook into sharp and, frankly, chilling focus.
It's the ultimate case study in this system of bribery and blackmail that the proof of weapons network relies on, isn't it?
It really is. Jared's father, Charles Kushner, is a convicted felon who built his empire using these ruthless tactics. He was a major political donor. He contributed upwards of $1.5 million to then Governor Jim McGreevey,
Right.
which directly resulted in Kushner getting a high-profile spot on the Port Authority Commission. But his criminality went far beyond simple bribery.
And the sources detail that infamous honey trap incident involving Charles Kushner, which sounds so extreme, it is hard to believe it was a documented court case.
Oh, it's documented fact. And it serves as the ultimate example of using personal compromise for leverage. When his own brother-in-law, a financial officer in his company, started cooperating with a federal investigation.
An investigation into Charles Kushner's illegal campaign contributions and financial practices.
Right. Kushner retaliated with, just staggering malice. He hired a prostitute for $10,000, orchestrated a seduction of his brother-in-law, and secretly recorded the encounter on videotape.
And then he used that recording as a weapon.
A brutal one. He mailed the compromising tape directly to his own sister, the wife of the victim, specifically to intimidate her and silence the family relative who was cooperating with the feds.
And he was convicted for that.
He was charged with tax fraud, witness tampering, and retaliation against a federal witness. He got 2 years in federal prison. This is the literal blueprint for blackmail that the patriarch of Trump's immediate family perfected.
It really sets the bar extremely low for ethical conduct and incredibly high for calculated ruthlessness.
And beyond that, the analysis points out deeper ties, alleging that Kushner was instrumental in setting up Governor McGreevey with an Israeli lover who later blackmailed him.
So another layer of these sexual entrapment tactics to achieve political control in New Jersey.
Exactly. And this all just reinforces the Kushner family's deep, long-standing political and financial ties to Israeli expansionism. Financing illegal settlements in the West Bank, maintaining an extremely close relationship with PM Benjamin Netanyahu,
Who, the sources note, has reportedly spent considerable time, maybe even sleeping, in Jared Kushner's bed.
That level of intimacy and shared ideology is precisely why the associated documentary is titled Trump's Zionist Ball and Chain.
Okay, so the documentary characterizes this deep relationship as Trump's Zionist ball and chain. How does the analysis argue this specifically creates a mechanism of control for the proof of weapons network?
Well, because the network operates by finding and leveraging pre-existing vulnerabilities. And Trump's own history is just as rooted in this compromised underworld, specifically his connections to the mob.
So he didn't need to be fully compromised by Epstein in the 90s.
No, he was already steeped in a system that accepted compromise as currency.
You can trace this back to the very foundation of his flagship building, Trump Tower.
Precisely. To construct Trump Tower, he used S&A Concrete, a firm that was famously controlled by Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, a powerful underboss of the Genovese crime syndicate.
And the payoff for this arrangement was a quid pro quo, wasn't it?
A clear one.
Yeah.
Guaranteed access to cheaper, non-union labor. The mob-controlled unions stayed away, which meant no labor disputes, which meant Trump could use underpaid, non-union workers, often undocumented immigrants, for massive demolition jobs.
And his primary liaison, his mentor in navigating these criminal waters, was the infamous mob lawyer, Roy Cohn.
Roy Cohn was his apprenticeship into the New York power game. He was Trump's direct line to these figures. A federal judge even confirmed this in one case, finding Trump engaged in a conspiracy for using underpaid, non-unionized Polish immigrants to demolition work.
All without any pushback from the mob-controlled unions.
So this wasn't just working around the law. It was a deep, symbiotic relationship with organized crime. It demonstrates a willingness to engage in labor conspiracy just for profit.
And later, his Atlantic City casino business also maintained deep ties to the mob. High-ranking Gambino crime family members were among his biggest customers. It just further cemented the transactional nature of his entire business structure.
So if you connect the dots, you see a clear pattern. A leader forged in a system where mob tactics, bribery, and blackmail are standard practices.
Mentored by the most corrupt fixers.
And then marries his daughter into a family whose patriarch literally wrote the playbook on honey trap blackmail. The conclusion for the proof of weapons network is pretty clear.
He is not an independent actor who just accidentally became a liability later in his life.
He is a predictable asset.
Yeah.
He understands the game because he's been playing it his entire career. The Epstein network was created precisely to control these types of powerful men across the FIC and the T-Take. The ball and chain is just. It's undeniable. It's the deep structural compromise that allows the geopolitical network to enforce its will.
Moving forward then, let's look at the actual recent release of the files. Dixon argues this is not a comprehensive, transparent effort aimed at justice, but it's really a meticulously, uh, strategically managed leak.
Political theater.
Political theater designed to completely obscure the deeper power struggle that's raging between the MIC and the FICTIC.
That's the nature of information warfare in this transition period. The sources clearly show a partisan battle that's designed to distract the public from the deeper truth. The initial move was made by the Democrats, right? Aiming to score a political victory.
They released 3 specific, cherry-picked, and heavily redacted emails that appeared to strongly implicate Trump.
I remember that. One mentioned something like, "The dog that hasn't barked is Trump. A victim spent hours at my house with him." Another suggested Trump knew about the girls. It created this immediate negative media frenzy.
Right, but the GOP immediately countered by just releasing over 20,000 files in bulk,
A data dump.
a data dump, including unredacted versions of those exact same Democratic emails. This was done to prove the Democrats were selectively leaking and manipulating the facts.
And here's where the strategy becomes visible. That key unredaction, it exposed the victim referenced in the email as Virginia Giuffre.
The prominent Prince Andrew accuser.
Exactly. And crucially, the full unredacted text showed Giuffre stating that Trump did not participate in any wrongdoing and that he couldn't have been friendlier.
So the GOP used that to successfully deflate the initial Democratic narrative, proving their selective editing.
And this back and forth, it perfectly illustrates how the files are being weaponized for short-term partisan advantage. It makes it look like a conventional political fight about who's the bigger sinner.
But then we have to examine the actions of the White House and the administration immediately following this exchange. And behavior is, well, it's highly suspicious.
It's really, really, really weird, as one source put it.
It escalated dramatically. First, you have the personal intervention by the president himself.
Right. Trump personally called Representative Lauren Boebert, urging her to withdraw her support for the bill that would mandate the full release of the Epstein files.
Which is strange. If a leader genuinely has nothing to hide, as they later champion with that no massage detail, why would they expend political capital to actively block the release of information that might exonerate them?
It makes no sense.
Okay.
And the weirdness wasn't confined to just a phone call. It escalated into a secure briefing in the Situation Room.
Right.
The Attorney General and the FBI Director summoned Rep. Boebert to a secure briefing in the White House Situation Room. I mean, that's a place normally reserved for discussing active military crises, intelligence on imminent threats, national security emergencies.
It's highly unusual. A correspondent noted this signals flashing intel and extremely high sensitivity from the highest levels of the establishment.
It shows an intense, powerful desire within the intelligence community and the proof of weapons network to keep this information contained, even if it meant pressuring Congress using national security rhetoric.
And the White House response, when questioned about this pressure, was just pure spin. They claimed the willingness to brief Congress members showed transparency.
Even though the explicit goal of the meeting was to block the legally mandated release of the files, it's classic obfuscation. You use the pretense of transparency, the meeting, to achieve the goal of secrecy, blocking the release.
But the most strategic and perhaps most controlling move came next. The sudden launch of a highly targeted partisan investigation.
Which is a total reversal.
Hmm.
Prior to this, the Department of Justice had repeatedly stated they had no credible evidence to predicate a full criminal investigation against uncharged third parties in the Epstein matter. That was their official policy.
And then a complete 180-degree reversal. Suddenly, Trump ordered Attorney General Pam Bondi to launch a full investigation. And crucially, he explicitly targeted only Democrats and associated fictitive figures.
Bill Clinton, Larry Summers, Reid Hoffman, JP Morgan Chase.
And he publicly framed it as an Epstein hoax involving Democrats, not Republicans.
So the analysis concludes that this targeted investigation was not about finding the truth at all. It was about creating an official, legal roadblock for any further transparency.
A preemptive move.
A preemptive move designed to legally justify withholding further sensitive documents from Congress and the public, regardless of partisan lines. The moment the DOJ declares the documents are part of an ongoing investigation, they can legally invoke executive privilege or investigative privilege to stonewall any further requests.
Let's just elaborate on that mechanism because it's so critical for understanding how this network exerts control. How exactly does changing the status to ongoing investigation shield these documents?
Well, legally, the principle is protecting the integrity of the investigation. Once a document is classified as evidence relevant to an active criminal probe, releasing it could potentially compromise witnesses, taint a jury pool, or reveal investigative techniques.
So, by making this move, the administration effectively created a blanket shield.
A blanket shield. While publicly it's targeting Democrats, the actual legal effect is protecting everyone. Republicans, high-level intelligence operatives, global financiers, fixed executives, anyone who might be compromised in the full, unredacted 20,000 files.
It's a masterful way of controlling the narrative and the flow of information. It just shows the intelligence community and the PWN still retain total command over the transparency process, regardless of the apparent political infighting.
Yeah, the partisan battle is just the performance. It's for public consumption.
Okay, now that we understand the strategic maneuvering, let's move past the political front line and focus on the shocking specifics contained within those 20,000 files. Because these specific nuggets, they provide crucial insight into the scope of Epstein's network and, perhaps most importantly, the leverage points that are still actively being used.
And the biggest, most glaring indicator of existing leverage and protection is the situation of Ghislaine Maxwell. Her treatment just screams protected status. It implies she holds immense destabilizing information.
She is a convicted sex offender involved in heinous crimes, yet she is held in a specific low security special prison in Bryan, Texas, a facility that's normally unsuitable for someone of her status and the severity of her charges.
The anecdotal reports from that facility are truly incredible. Staff are reportedly sick of being Maxwell's bitch, waiting on her hand and foot.
And most bizarrely, she's even been given a puppy as part of her routine preferential treatment.
A puppy. I mean, this level of comfort for a convicted criminal suggests a quid pro quo of staggering proportions.
That extreme preferential treatment, it only fuels one line of speculation. What specific compromising information does she hold that is so dangerous to the proof of weapons network?
What is the price of her silence or her continued cooperation? That it necessitates granting her a lifestyle upgrade in federal prison.
It forces us to ask, what do they fear she might reveal about the network's ties to high finance, intelligence operations, or political figures like Trump?
Her status is a direct metric of the power of the leverage she represents. If she's protecting the network, it's because the network values its own continuity over any appearance of justice.
Let's turn to the shocking figure of Michael Wolff, the journalist, who comes off terribly in these released emails. It really reveals the corrupt media intelligence complex that was surrounding Epstein.
Oh, the sources describe Wolf as one of the most disgusting figures in the release. I mean, far from being a neutral journalist, he was essentially acting as a sophisticated PR and intelligence agent for Epstein back in 2016.
Trying to fix his reputation and manage his vulnerabilities as Trump began his political ascent.
And the most explosive revelation is the conspiracy to generate debt from Trump. Emails show Wolf strategizing with Epstein on how to handle Trump's impending political success. This wasn't just fixing a PR problem, it was active political engineering.
It really was. Wolff explicitly suggested that Epstein could either hang him, meaning expose some level of compromise to control his behavior,
Or, if it really looks like he could win, you could save him, generating a debt.
that phrase, generating a debt, that is the language of control, isn't it?
It's a direct blueprint for blackmail or quid pro quo access control. If Epstein saved Trump from some damaging revelation, the expected return would be guaranteed access, protection, influence over political decisions.
Which is exactly what the Proof of Weapons Network requires of its assets.
And Wolf even offered Epstein direct assistance with a lawsuit against Epstein and Trump, telling him to let me know if there's anything I can do.
It just reveals how deep the rot goes. The very media figures who are tasked with accountability were actively working to create and manage leverage for a convicted sex offender.
And speaking of Trump, the files present what Dixon describes as a mixed bag regarding his contact, which the analysis suggests is entirely intentional to maintain ambiguity and control.
On one hand, you have the exculpatory detail that's been used heavily by the GOP. Epstein is quoted stating Trump never got a massage.
Right, that's the clean narrative they push.
But the incriminating details directly contradict Trump's public denials. Epstein also claimed Trump knew about the girls and asked Ghislaine Maxwell to stop.
And furthermore, the document strongly suggests contact after the early 2000s cutoff that Trump repeatedly claimed.
Specifically, we have records that suggest a potential Thanksgiving meeting where Epstein named Trump as attending.
And a far more recent 2019 mention in a London email where Epstein stated, Prince Andrew and Trump today, too funny.
So the juxtaposition of the no massage detail with the 2019 contact maintains that critical ambiguity. They give him enough to defend himself, but hold enough to contradict him.
It ensures he remains a compliant variable. Then you have Steve Bannon, a major political strategist who appears to have a far closer and more reliant relationship with Epstein than the public ever understood.
Emails reveal Bannon asked Epstein to intervene on his behalf with Michael Wolff, telling Epstein to ask Wolff to lay off me.
Which shows Bannon viewed Epstein not just as a wealthy contact, but as a trusted intermediary with the power to manage media narratives, a true node in the network.
The fact that a powerful political strategist like Bannon couldn't just handle Wolff himself, but had to route the request through Epstein, it speaks volumes about Epstein's perceived influence and position within the PWN.
It does. And their conversation about another individual caught in child pornography charges was noted as strangely concerned and detailed. They were discussing specifics like mandatory minimums, extradition. It suggests a level of intimacy and shared knowledge about the network's vulnerabilities.
The network's reach, as evidenced by these files, it extended far beyond domestic political strategists. It clearly implicates foreign governments and high-level global elites.
Yeah. The files show Epstein advised Vitaly Churkin, the Russian ambassador to the UN at the time, on understanding Trump and U.S. domestic politics. He noted, Churkin was great. He understood Trump after our conversations. It's not complex.
So that places Epstein as a geopolitical explainer and a connector for major foreign diplomats, a role that goes far beyond simple finance.
And the sources reinforce deep connections to both Israeli intelligence and Gulf royalty. Connections to Israeli spies who allegedly met at his house, and a UAE royal.
And on the academic and financial elite front, there was Larry Summers, the former Harvard president and Treasury Secretary.
Right, he was caught sharing a controversial insight with Epstein regarding Harvard admissions and behavior, a very sensitive topic, which Summers shared with the caveat, do not repeat this insight. Oops, now everybody has it.
It just illustrates the casual, high-stakes trade of sensitive political, financial, and academic information among this global elite group, with Epstein serving as a central compromise node for the proof of weapons network.
So if we just step back and summarize the full scope of Simon Dixon's analysis, what we have is a system that compromises leaders through their history and deep-seated mob ties,
Controls them through intelligence and leverage, like Ghislaine Maxwell.
and uses strategically managed leaks of that compromise, the files, to force compliance during a global power shift, the transition away from dollar dominance.
That is the core summary. The Proof of Weapons Network is leveraging the Epstein files not as some moral or legal crusade for justice, but as a highly refined instrument of control in a major geopolitical transition.
They're enforcing discipline on all their assets, FEs, TIC, and political, to ensure the transition occurs according to the network's long-term financial goals, even if the MIC fights it every single step of the way.
So, the key takeaway for you, the listener, is that the very loud, very dramatic political fight between the Democrats and the GOP over these files, the arguments about who is implicated and who is misleading, is the necessary distraction.
It is. It's the front line designed to make you believe this is about politics, not global finance.
But the real war is between the FIC and the tech, who are pushing for regional stability and a multipolar world to facilitate their distressed acquisition strategy.
And the MIC, which is fighting desperately to maintain the forever war of dollar dominance. Epstein's network is simply providing the intelligence and the leverage needed to force powerful, compromised figures into compliance with the winning side's agenda.
So, given everything we've covered, the pattern of strategically managed leaks, the DOJ's sudden, unprecedented flip flop on investigative policy, and the administration's high level attempts in the Situation Room to block transparency via a partisan investigation, what level of leverage must be held by the intelligence community and the Proof of Weapons Network itself that they can force a complete and total reversal of federal DOJ policy just to prevent the full unredacted truth from reaching you?
That is the question.
That is the question that defines our current era of controlled information and global power dynamics. We encourage you to analyze the news flow through this Proof of Weapons framework.
Okay, well, that's all I've got for you today. Pretty gross. But I hope you understand how it works and how to protect yourself and how to see through the narrative. We're at the time of truth. We're at the time of understanding how to use information. And the most important thing for me is that you're not a part of the manufactured civil unrest and hate campaigns, because the Proof of Weapons Network wants you to hate each other. They want you to be violent to each other. They want you to manufacture the environment that justifies the surveillance state. They're weaponizing technology. They're weaponizing media. They're weaponizing algorithms. They're vassalizing. And I hope you at least get that this isn't about character assassinations. This is about understanding the systemic nature of what props up the dollar as we move to this managed transition. And I believe that competition is actually the answer, because this whole network was all around elimination of competition. You listen to Peter Thiel, he talks about his policy, anything to eliminate competition. The entire dollar dominance was based upon death, destruction, violence, pillaging, and propping up unnaturally a dollar. Let's move to a multipolar world. We're going to enter into currency wars. We're seeing how the Bitcoin side is playing in that, the gold side is playing in that, the macro side is playing out, the geopolitical side. It is clear that everyone involved in technology, in positions of influence, everyone involved in these different types of companies, these political processes, money is used in order to corrupt power, and power is used in order to gain money. And that's the rules of the game. It doesn't matter what system you have. You can call it communism. You can call it capitalism. You can call it socialism. You can call it whatever you want. It is in following the monetary flows that we get to see how the world really works. And it seems like in every system, this is what we have. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get hurt. Others are going to do really well. I want to make sure you're on the right side of that change. So how do we get on the right side of that change? What we learned in this week in Bitcoin and the connection to the Epstein Files is that this decentralized technology in a constant struggle that allows for maths and code to enforce a resistance against this corrupting power, this proof of weapons network, this fiat currency Orwellian nightmare that we're ushering in through stablecoins and central bank digital currencies. It's clear that Bitcoin was a gateway drug. So what can we learn from that? Well, we can learn that it wasn't a honeypot. And if it wasn't a honeypot, it means there wasn't a back door. So why did it go open source? Why did it end up on this distributed supercomputer? Why did we maintain the ability to verify transactions by running our own nodes? Why was there a resistance that was allowed to form through the users to take on the power miners and the power venture capitalists and the power structures that were being compromised? And why is it that that was allowed to persist? And therefore, how do they fight back with false narratives? And so why do we believe that the answer to taking on the system is to trust in a public company that's taking on debt instruments and is fully vassalized into the proof of weapons network, in order to believe that if they centralize as much Bitcoin as possible into strategy and leverage these debt instruments, that the more and more Bitcoin gets centralized into that one company, that one honeypot, because Bitcoin isn't a honeypot. Bitcoin was the gateway drug to these treasury companies. Bitcoin was the gateway drug to stable coins. Bitcoin was the gateway drug to central bank digital currencies. Bitcoin was the gateway drug to put your Bitcoin in custody and borrow against your Bitcoin. Bitcoin was the gateway drug for the financial industrial complex to centralize as much Bitcoin as they could get hands on, and then get you to end up giving them your Bitcoin as they manage this transition. On the macro side, They're doing fiscal dominance. The fiat currency rails are dying. They are asset stripping the average American in this K-shaped economy where they don't give a damn about the people. They only care about those that they have leverage over in order to prop up that stock market by utilizing the debt capital markets to print more fiat currency so that they can make those on the network richer at the expense of the others that are enslaved in debt and paying the interest on that debt, trying to roll it over in a 55-year mortgage while they beg for a $2,000 subsidy from some fake tariffs that was a tax on American imports. And you think that's bad? As they take the tactics that they used in Asia, they used in the Middle East, they used in the global South, they used in Africa, they're bringing them home in order to manufacture civil unrest, because when they can no longer exert influence through the dollar globally, what do? They exert influence regionally. And we're led to believe that we should try and prop up the dollar for patriotism, that we should trust in a plan, that we should look at these compromised people in these vassalized networks to build structured project Bitcoin bonds, collateralized debt obligations in order to fool us into giving our Bitcoin to them so that you can borrow against your Bitcoin to roll over a little bit more debt relief in the system that they created. And what is the macro picture? Fiscal dominance, K-shaped economy. You need to decide where you're going to sit in this network, what options are available to you. Are you going to trust those that have these public companies? Or are you going to understand that maths and code and open source is what you need to give yourself a little bit of breathing space? And they don't want you to have that breathing space. So what's happening on the geopolitical side? We have seen what this dollar is backed by. We have seen the compromises. And we have one job on this earth, which is, at least, can we all universally agree, our job is to protect our children. And now we're not even having our children because people are broke and people can't communicate with each other. The birth rates are going down. That's why they want all this artificial intelligence and robotics. That's why they're pushing the world to the people that are going to be able to be that labor. And we're all fighting with each other. And we're told that it's all these different religious and ethnic groups. And we're told that we need to care about things that we don't really need to care about, because we were put on this earth to serve humanity, to fight oppression. Why were we created? Why were we put on this earth? Were we there in order to take away our children and use children in human trafficking, in sex trafficking, in blackmail operations? Were we there to commit genocides, ethnic cleansing? Are this what we're meant to be doing to our children? At least universally, we can agree that we should fight back and boycott this system with everything we got. I believe that the financial industrial complex is too big, but we fight back with competition. We fight back with currency wars. We fight back with multipolarity. We fight back with peace, love, and unity, because peace, love, and unity is the last thing they want as they divide and conquer. That's the last thing they want. And you have to believe all the division, so you can't see what controls the West at the moment. You can't see what's happening in front of you. People call me conspiracy theorist, doomer. What's doomerism? About wanting to have more competition in the world so that we can rebalance more in line with what I think the creator wanted us to be. More competition. And the ability to own our own money, which is a form of digital freedom that they want to censor and to take you into this Orwellian nightmare so that you're just a node and a cog in the wheel. Just like I was when I was an investment banker. Just like I was when I had to bow down to the regulator. Just like I was when I had to be a good shareholder for the network. This is what Bitcoin provides to people, the ability to own your own money. Spend it in and innocent until proven guilty. So it's less likely to be weaponized against you, so that you can eventually, through fixed money supply, build a network effect. And then maybe you end up with some gold outside the system. Maybe you have a chance of actually not having to borrow against your Bitcoin to mine some fiat currency based upon what we're being told, that we should be mining fiat currency by putting our Bitcoin in custody and borrowing against it, so that we can become slaves to those custodians, so that we can become manipulated by those exchanges, so that instead of owning Bitcoin, we put it in a 401k wrapper and buy a Bitcoin ETF that they can leverage and build a Bitcoin-backed security and a Bitcoin-backed collateralized debt obligation insured by some Bitcoin credit default swap, as they tokenize everything in these real-world assets, as they take fiat currency and program it into this social credit score. We got 5 years where we're probably going to see 200 years of change. And what are they going to do to shut us up? Call us a conspiracy theory. I think that right now that we're blessed with the fact that we have freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. Because they won't give me the freedom of reach, I rely upon you to share this with as many people as possible. I'll break it down. Our team will break it down into AI summaries. We're a little bit clunky with the technology sometimes. We'll break it down into just the Bitcoin part, the macro part, the geopolitical part, so you can take the piece that someone might be most interested in. But here's the reality. They ain't going to look after us anymore. We have to take care of each other. We have to build community. We have to recognize that we need to spend local. We can't spend in these large mega monopolies for all we can. We can't get it perfect. We won't get it perfect. I can't be unproductive and not use artificial intelligence. Do I know that I'm contributing to the network? Yeah. But what can we do? We can only do better rather than worse. Don't allow perfectionism to not allow you to own your own money, spend your own money, and benefit from this fixed supply. And you know what? Maybe the financial industrial complex wins. Maybe the proof of weapons network has accumulated more power, but there is a greater power. And that greater power tends to make these evil networks, they benefit, and then they push right back in. And it's more like there is this, look at the British Empire, look at the Portuguese Empire, look at the Roman Empire. These are petty little vassalized proof of weapons network prostitutes that run these countries when they were on top of the game. There's something our creator seems to do, seems to take us in a direction where when it gets too evil, it snaps back. And are you a part of that inadvertently? Are you a useful idiot for the network? Are you taking your cold, hard cash and putting in a Bitcoin treasury company? Are you borrowing against it? Who do you work for? Who do the people around you work for? Do you know who you work for? Well, I will continue to share the best of the information that I can put together, and I welcome your feedback on the things that I get wrong, because I'm here to commit to learning and being accurate. And you can call me a conspiracy theorist. You can call me a doomer. You can call me deluded. You can call me whatever you want to call me. I will just continue to give the best of what I learn and share it with you so that you can do with it as you choose. And that's what we need to do here. This is Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 108, unmasking this Epstein network, the JP Morgan connections, the Trump operations, the weaponization of Bitcoin to try and connect it to Jeffrey Epstein. And I'll be back in the new year because I'm going to take a little bit of break in December, but I will keep releasing videos and I'll be on X. I've got a bunch of videos that I'm going to schedule out throughout the whole of December. In January, we'll come back for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 109. But please do check in with me on X, because I will never commit suicide. I am perfectly happy. I am very happy with how things are right now. But I will continue to expose the network, and we need to look out for each other. So if you enjoyed this, I do no monetization, no sponsorship. I've tried to release myself from any connections to anything that can compromise to the best of my ability. I've got nothing to sell. I'm deleveraging from all of my positions that would compromise me from being able to tell anything but the truth. And I've told you from my 25 years of experience how these networks work and the different tools that they use. If you enjoy it, please do share this. The algorithm will not give me freedom of reach. It will only give me freedom of speech and give you the ability to share it. But we can hack the algorithms, put the like, put comments there. I read them all. I answer to them whenever I can. If you want to download this, I know it's a lot to take in, then please do go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and you can subscribe to Bitcoin Hard Talk. If I get taken off YouTube, then head over to Rumble, follow me over there, and we'll be going live on Rumble. If I get taken off Rumble, I'll be on X, and I'll continue streaming over there, and I'll keep talking there, building my social credit score, but giving as much information until they take it away from us. Building as much sovereignty, because if we don't get enough of our sovereignty together, then we don't know what the next phase looks like. But I do know that I'll keep sharing it for as long as I'm able to. And in case all of that goes down, simondixon.com, I publish all my own stuff over there. And we've got a Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal where we push as many tools and videos and uploads in there. And if we get taken off every network, I'll be streaming over there. So I hope you enjoyed Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 108. And I will see you over December with all the videos that we'll release. And I'll be back for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 109 in January. Peace.